This is BBC News with the latest headlines. In local elections in England, the Conservatives suffer a series of significant losses in London, but across the country, Labour are only making modest gains.
We've had some difficult results, and you can see that in London. I would say, though, that we are mid-term, and it's quite a mixed picture because you look elsewhere, whether that's in Hartlepool or Nuneaton or Thurrock, we've actually made gains.
Believe you me, this is a big turning point for us. From the depths of 2019, that general election, back on track.
Elsewhere, the Liberal Democrats and Greens are making gains. In Hull, the Liberal Democrats won control of the council from Labour. Counting is getting underway for the local elections in Scotland and Wales, and also in Northern Ireland, where voters have been having their say over forming a new government. And in other news, the UN says a new convoy is heading to the Ukrainian city of Mariupol in an attempt to rescue scores of civilians trapped underground with little food or water. Good morning and welcome to BBC News, with continuing coverage of the election results across the UK. So far, it's been a mixed picture for all the parties. In England, the Conservatives have lost control of three symbolic London councils, Westminster, Barnet and Wandsworth, to Labour. The Liberal Democrats and Greens have also made gains across England. Counting has only just begun in council elections across Scotland and Wales and in Northern Ireland, where voters have been electing members of the Stormont Assembly. So here's the state of play for the parties. Let's take a look. You can see here 75 of 146 English councils declared. Labour have added 34 to their tally, bringing the total to 1,200 councillors. The Conservatives have lost 122 council seats, so they are on 540. A good night and morning so far for the Liberal Democrats. They're on 259, having added 59 councillors. Residents groups there, 40. They've added 6. And the Greens, an impressive 23 for them, bringing their total of councillors to 39. If we have a look at the number of councils, you can see that Labour have added 3. We've mentioned those 3 London councils, very symbolic, taken them from the Conservatives, puts them on 37. The Conservatives are down 6 on 18. The Liberal Democrats are on 4. They've added 1. They've taken Hull from Labour. Residents and Green on 0. Hung councils, no overall control, have added another 2, taking that total to 16. Our political correspondent Helen Catt has the story so far.
A symbolic win for Labour. Wandsworth in South London, Tory for 44 years until now. Even in an election about local services, having the lowest council tax in the country didn't keep it blue.
The cost of living crisis did come up, as did the massive cuts from the government since 2010, and also Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was a vote winner for Labour, as indeed was Keir Starmer as well. And I remind you, Hugh, in 1998, a year after our landslide victory, we didn't win this seat in Wandsworth. In 2002, a year after our landslide victory in 2001, we didn't win this seat in Wandsworth, and we've done it in 2022.
Wandsworth's former leader blamed the loss on the cost of living and said what he called the issue of Boris Johnson was raised. That was echoed by some Tory councillors elsewhere.
It's Partygate, it's not just Partygate. There's the integrity issue. Basically, I just don't feel people any longer have the confidence that the Prime Minister can be relied upon to tell the truth.
In a surprising upset, the Conservatives lost Westminster Council to Labour, as well as Southampton and Barnet in North London, where the Labour leader went to mark the result.
This is a massive turning point for the Labour Party. From the depths of 2019, we're back on track now for the general election, showing what the change that we've done, the hard change we've done in the last 2 years, what a difference it has made.
Others maintain things aren't as bad as they could be for the Tories.
We've had some difficult results, and you can see that in London. I would say, though, that we are mid-term, and it's quite a mixed picture because you look elsewhere, whether that's in Hartlepool or Nuneaton or Thurrock, we've actually made gains. And I think if you take the whole picture of this, it really doesn't demonstrate that Labour has the momentum to form the next government.
Labour won the newly created Cumberland Council in the northwest, but is not expecting big gains, and it's had losses too. The Liberal Democrats, who've had a strong night, took whole council from it.
And what was really interesting about last night's results, in places like Wimbledon and Cheadle and elsewhere, we were winning seats where we need to win seats in the next general election. So it was a great night for those councillors.
The Greens too have made gains. Also overnight, in Bristol, voters chose to scrap their mayor in a referendum. This is all only a partial picture. Almost half of England's councils have yet to start counting and will do so later today. So too will all of the councils in Wales and Scotland. And counting will start for all 90 seats in the Northern Ireland Assembly, with polls suggesting that Sinn Féin could become the largest party for the first time. Helen Catt, BBC News.
Let's chat to Chris Curtis, from Head of Political Polling at Opinium Research. Welcome to you, Chris. You're going to be with us for an hour. Let's just get a snapshot from you now. What's your general takeaway of what you've seen?
I think it's a disappointing night for the Conservatives, particularly in London, but not a great night really across the rest of England as well. But I still think it's fair to say that Labour is struggling to make the kind of gains that they'd need to make if they were heading for a majority at the next general election. So Tories down, Labour still not convinced the public that they're ready for government, and that's pretty much in line with what we've been seeing in the opinion polls in recent weeks as well.
Oh, right. So it has sort of followed the polling figures that we've had over the past few weeks?
Oh, yeah, almost certainly. I mean, as far as expectations goes, this is pretty much dead on where I expected. Maybe slightly better for Labour in London, but apart from that, everything's fallen out how the opinion polls would have suggested.
We'll come back to you in just a moment, but let's get some more detailed analysis of the results so far. We can cross the newsroom to Lewis Goodall at the touchscreen. Lewis, give us your sort of first analysis, if you like, of the figures so far. I know it's a mixed picture, but is there anything in terms of trends that you're seeing?
Well, Jo, let's take it one region at a time, shall we? First of all, let's get London out of the way. And we shouldn't underestimate London. Sometimes there's a tendency to say, well, it's just London. What about the rest of the country? Well, remember, London has 70 parliamentary seats. It has more parliamentary seats than Scotland. It's a huge part of our electoral geography. And increasingly, the Conservatives are an endangered species. Remember, they only had seven councils going into this election. They're probably going to come out with 2 or 3. One of them that they've lost is Wandsworth. This, as we know, had been a Conservative council since 1978, the so-called flagship Margaret Thatcher jewel in the crown. You've heard all of the cliches already many times this morning, I'm sure, and Labour have taken it, and have taken it handily. 8 seats gained, Conservatives lost 8. They're going to be in control there. Of course, in terms of parliamentary politics, probably doesn't matter that much because all 3 seats in the Wandsworth borough are already Labour held. Indeed, Putney was their only net gain at the last general election, you might remember. Let's look elsewhere in London. In some ways, I think Westminster is the more surprising borough that Labour have managed to take. We expected Wandsworth to happen. Not many Labour people thought Westminster would happen. This has been Conservative even longer than Wandsworth, since its creation, since Harold Wilson was Prime Minister in 1964. And again, this, the home of Buckingham Palace and Marble Arch and all of these splendid, salubrious places of central London, not exactly known in the past for hosting Labour MPs or anything to do with Labour at all. The Ritz Hotel, and amongst other things. 13 seats gained for the Labour Party, 13 losses for the Conservatives. A spectacular win by all accounts. Instead of being these redouts of Thatcherism as they were in the 80s, they're now a symbol of Labour dominance in the capital. But Labour didn't just have victories so far in the capital. We saw Southampton, somewhere that frankly didn't need too much of a gain for Labour to take. They only lost it, as you can see here, in 2021, but nonetheless a reasonably modest performance. But 4 up 4, Conservatives down 4, enough to take the borough. And indeed, there has been a tendency a little bit to talk about London good for Labour, North bad for Labour. Maybe there's a bit of truth in that, but it doesn't hold everywhere. That's what's a bit perplexing about these results, because then you go to somewhere like Cumberland. This is a new unitary authority in Cumbria, in the northwest of England. So all of these seats were sort of notional, really, but nonetheless, you can see Labour have won this new council. 12 seats gained, Conservatives lost 14. And remember that what's really important about this, and what Labour will really take heart from it, and the Conservatives will be slightly worried about, is that this has a part of the country which has crucial swing seats, many of which the Conservatives only won in 2019 or 2017. 2017, Copeland, you might remember, the canary in the Corbynite coal mine, you might call it. In 2017 by-election, it was won by the Conservatives' Theresa May. It was one of those first bricks of the blue wall to fall. You've got Workington Man, you might remember from the 2019 general election. Well, Workington Man, according to this, basically voted for Labour last night. So the Conservatives will be worried about that. But then, just when you think you've got a trend going, you look at somewhere like Amber Valley or Nuneaton. These are places that until relatively recently were Labour controlled. So you go back to 2019, Labour were controlling this council. But instead of Labour making gains, they are slipping further and further and further away from the Labour column. And as you can see, these sort of places, 60% leave voting. All of the London ones that have been gained very heavily remain voting. You'll remember, Joe, in 2015, the Nuneaton seat, Ed Miliband knew that he was never going to be Prime Minister when that came in. Again, slipping away from Labour. Until 2018, it was Labour controlled, but just little by little, it's slipping further from their grasp. So what you can sort of say about this is that Labour are doing okay. The Conservatives are doing not that well, but then again, they have been in government for 12 years. You might expect that. And it all really depends on what you're comparing it with. Because if you're comparing Labour's performance with 2019 or 2021, the local elections, then they are doing quite a bit better, particularly in London, maybe a little bit worse outside of London, but they're doing all right. If you're comparing it, though, and essentially they're doing as well as they did in 2018. But of course, we know that 2018 isn't good enough for the Labour Party probably to become the biggest party, or indeed, let alone, form a majority government. So they'll take some heart from these results, and the Conservatives, conversely, will take some heart from these results as well. There is something and nothing in these results for everybody, which probably isn't very satisfying for anybody, but of course we've got many more to come throughout the day. So maybe more trends will present themselves as they do.
Lewis Goodall there. Thank you very much for that. We'll definitely be back to you for more trends. But yes, I can see it's difficult to actually tell winners and losers overall on the figures we have so far. I introduced Chris Curtis, the head of political polling at Opinium Research earlier. We're also joined by the BBC London's political correspondent, Susan Mendonça. Let's start with London. Labour will obviously be celebrating those very important symbolic wins, although it's a capital city that was already trending towards Labour. But they are important, aren't they, to Keir Starmer, who's been in Barnet, one of those gains already this morning.
And we look at Barnet, for example, the last time round, Labour didn't manage to take Barnet, and they were it was tipped that they were going to take Barnet. They didn't manage to, and it was largely seen as being down to the issues of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. It's a very Jewish area. There are a lot of people from Jewish community there, and it didn't go down well. And so the fact that Labour have managed to take Barnet now, I suppose for a lot of people within the Labour Party, they will see that as an example of the Jewish community certainly coming round to Labour after a period of time where they have not.
Well, and while you're talking, we can show our viewers actually the seats and the majority for Labour in Barnet. There you can see Labour on 41, Conservatives on 22. Very much a straightforward Labour-Conservative fight. You're absolutely right. The Conservative MP, of course, Theresa Villiers, still there, but it will be interesting. She will be worried, no doubt, about her seat at the next general election.
Exactly. And last time round, her seat, it was very close. And so, she's holding on by a whisker, and looking at what's happening in terms of the result today with Barnet, she will be looking at whether or not she manages to keep hold of her seat next time round. I think Wandsworth, where I was earlier on today, what I found quite interesting was that even though it looked as though Wandsworth was going to Labour, the Labour people there that I was speaking to were being very cautious about calling it. They didn't want to call it.
Well, expectation management, of course,
exactly, because last time round they actually got the popular vote there, but they didn't manage to get the votes where they needed them, so they didn't manage to get enough of the wards. This time round, there have been boundary changes which have changed things up a bit. They did manage to win it, and as you can imagine, they were jubilant when they did.
Right. What about reaction? Just before I come to Chris, what about reaction from Conservatives who've lost there?
Yeah, so we spoke to Ravi Govinda, who is was the leader. Of course, now no longer the leader, the Conservative there. And what I found interesting was that he was not blaming Boris Johnson. He was saying it's too early to say what the reason is for why all of this has happened. And he's talked about, about, for example, the cost of living being something that came up, national issues playing a part. In terms of his own local record, he's still very much of the opinion that the Conservatives there were running things well. They are seen traditionally as the low council tax borough, well managed financially. And so it's national issues rather than local ones that the local Conservatives there are talking about as being the reason for why they've lost this.
Chris, let's talk about, perhaps in the political jargon, about baseline comparison. Lewis mentioned that you have to look at these seats to some extent against when they were last contested in 2018 to see how much progress Labour is making and the Conservatives are either sort of losing or standing still.
Yeah, this is quite a complicated thing to explain, so I'm sorry if I don't do a particularly good job at it. But basically the point is there was a lot of things that changed between the 2018 local elections, when the seats that were fought last night were previously fought, and the 2019 general election when Boris Johnson won that landslide victory. There was a massive realignment that happened in politics, with Leave voters and Leave voting areas moving towards the Conservatives and Remain voting areas pretty much sticking with the Labour Party. So what that means is when we see these results tonight, particularly in those red wall areas that moved away from Labour between the 2018 local elections and the 2019 general elections, what we see there is maybe Labour moving slightly backwards in those results last night compared to 2018, but actually that's still a recovery on the results that they achieved in those places in the 2019 general election. Another way of putting it, I think, is probably this. Yes, Labour is doing slightly worse in the red wall than they did in 2018. But in 2018, they won the red wall. It was only in the 2019 general election that they lost it. So actually, last night, Labour probably won the popular vote, across those red wall seats. It would be enough, not necessarily to give the Labour Party a majority in government, probably not even the largest party, but it would almost certainly be enough to put Keir Starmer in Downing Street if the results last night were replicated on a general election.
And of course we have got to get the results from Scotland and Wales, and there's been plenty of talk and indications that Labour could overtake the Conservatives to be the second party in Scotland behind the SNP, although not much evidence that they would take seats or that many seats off the SNP in Scotland, where all the councils are being contested. Our political correspondent Nick Eardley is in Barnet for us now. We've just been talking about it. Hello to you, Nick, on what looks like a lovely sunny day. Of course, I can't tell from inside here at the studio. How is it looking there?
It is very sunny actually, Jo. It's a lovely day. Keir Starmer was here about 40 minutes ago, and this is definitely one of those seats that you're going to hear, or one of these councils I should say, that you're going to hear Labour shouting about over the next 24 hours, along with the likes of Wandsworth and Westminster, those parts of London they've struggled to win in the past, but they've won pretty comfortably actually overnight. The message from Keir Starmer here actually was as much about anti-Semitism as anywhere else. This borough has the highest Jewish population of any local authority in England, and you'll remember when Keir Starmer took over as Labour leader, he made winning back the support of the Jewish population one of his key priorities. But I suppose there is just that bigger question that Keir Starmer will be mulling over as he jumps on a train to his next visit, which is, what does this whole picture tell us about where Labour's support is based now? Because their vote in London is clearly stronger than perhaps it's ever been. You know, maybe some of the old jokes you used to make about Scotland, where you weighed Labour's votes, might become true of large parts of London. But he'll be really keeping an eye on the results over the next few hours in places like the north of England, the Old Red Wall, in Scotland, where Scottish Labour are confident of coming second ahead of the Scottish Tories now, but the extent to which they do that will be really important, and in Wales, because Labour probably need to pick up some seats in Wales if they're going to be on course for a general election victory. So, you know, I don't know if you could hear much of what Keir Starmer was saying there. He was as enthusiastic as I've ever seen him this morning. But there is that wider question and that wider challenge about whether the Tory losses overnight are translating to big Labour gains, and whether the picture might actually be a bit more complicated.
Well, absolutely, Keir Starmer is celebrating what has happened in London. What about the Conservative reaction because what I've heard so far is they are pointing, of course, to the broader picture because of those significant losses in London. But these are really totemic councils that have gone, haven't they? That in itself must be worrying Conservative Central Office.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think it'll be worrying Number 10 in particular, because speaking to Tory MPs over the last few weeks when they've been pounding the streets in London, many of them saw this coming. Maybe not Westminster's result, but some of maybe the Wandsworth result, maybe the result here. And they were blaming it on Partygate. They were saying that Boris Johnson just isn't popular on the doorsteps in places like London. Now, they were caveating that by saying if you go to some places in the north of England, that's not so much an issue. It's more the cost of living. But in some of those, if you could use a lazy term like middle class, some of those middle class councils in England, there was a feeling that Boris Johnson was becoming a bit of a liability rather than an asset. Interesting, of course, because he was mayor of London and won over many of those areas about 15 years ago, but maybe has become slightly unpopular there. And one of the questions that will be interesting to watch over the next few hours is whether some of those Tories who are losing their seats, whether more of those Tories who are losing their seats are coming out in saying that. So we've had a few in London saying, look, we think this wasn't down to us, it was down to the bigger picture, it was down to the Prime Minister and the fine he got for breaking COVID laws. The Scottish Tories, I was speaking to a source there last night who was utterly scathing. They think they're going to take an absolute battering over the next few hours north of the border. And they were saying it's solely down to the Prime Minister and to Partygate. Similar picture may well emerge in certain parts of Wales if the Conservatives go backwards. So it's been a bad night for the Tories. It's not been a catastrophic night for the Tories. Don't get the impression from the chats I've had this morning that we're about to see some sort of coup and that Boris Johnson's leadership is under imminent threat, but don't mistake that for a lack of nervousness. There are many in the Conservative Party looking at this result and thinking, hold on, those fines that Boris Johnson and some of his staff got and that Partygate issue is having an electoral impact.
Nick Eardley there, our political correspondent in Barnet. Thank you very much. Well, let's test the temperature with the Conservative MP, Stockton-on-Tees. It is the Tory MP, Matt Vickers. Hello to you, Matt.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. You've lost over 100 council seats overall and you've lost control of 6 councils. What conclusions do you draw from that?
I think, you know what, there are 3 groups of people who will be disappointed this morning. The electors, the residents of Westminster and Wandsworth. In Westminster, they've enjoyed the lowest council tax in the country for years. Wandsworth, the second lowest council tax, they'll be disappointed. The journalists like you, I think, this morning will be struggling to find that headline because actually it wasn't what it was stoked up to be, was it?
Right, well, don't worry about me and the headline we may or may not be struggling to find. You have actually lost council seats overall. You have named, yes, definitely the symbolic London ones that have gone, but you've lost control of Worcester Council and West Oxfordshire and Southampton. You've made losses across England, haven't you? Why is that?
These are, well, let's put it in context. These are midterm elections after 12 years of the party in government, skewed towards Labour's base in London. It should have been Labour's day. We saw the biggest poll put out by Electoral Calculus and Find Out Now said we were going to lose 800 seats. This should have been Labour's day. They've fallen well short of that. No one ever
really thought it would be as much as 800 seats. That really would have been a complete and utter disaster for the Conservatives. As I say, there is a spread. There is a spread in terms of the losses for Conservatives. I'm just trying to get from you what you think is the problem here. What caused those losses?
I think you've got to look at where we've made success as well. Actually, Labour should be 12 years in government, midterm elections. They should be making massive improvements. But actually, they're still losing ground in Sunderland, in Tyneside, in Hartlepool, in Nuneaton, in Sandwell, in the Amber Valley, everywhere. They're in the north of England. You know what? Keir's brand from the London elite has made some progress in London. But actually, when you look at places like Wandsworth, there was only 141 votes across the entire borough.
Does it not matter? Does it not matter then that you've lost Westminster, Wandsworth and Barnet? Can they just go?
I don't think that's the case at all. They've got some very hard-working councillors who've lost a seat, and I'm bitterly disappointed by that. But actually, in real terms, when you look at the national picture, is this a party that's striving towards government and making real progress.
I tell you
Not
what,
at all.
let's
Not
stick
at-
with the Conservative
Well,
Party, because that's the party that you represent. And you say that in the north of England, Labour hasn't made the inroads that they should have done. And that is true to a certain extent. But actually, you have done badly in Cumberland, in the northwest. And the Conservative leader of Carlisle City Council, the outgoing leader, has come up with a reason for why they have done badly, the Conservatives. He said that Boris Johnson bears a lot of responsibility for these very poor results. He said it's with Partygate and the issue of integrity more widely. Basically, I just don't feel people any longer have the confidence that the Prime Minister can be relied upon to tell the truth. Is he right?
Do you know what? I'll take you back 5 years. No, I'll take you back 3 years.
No, let's just do last night.
Last night, yeah, well, when you put it, you've got to put it in context. You've got to put it in context, and the context is not there for that headline that we've done terribly badly across the country. In Hartlepool, 3 years ago in Hartlepool, we would not for a moment have assumed that we would have had a Conservative MP there. Last night, despite the fact we're 12 years in government, despite the fact this is a midterm election, we made gains. We gained seats on Hartlepool Council last night.
Right.
This thing is completely a loss for the government.
But can Boris Johnson... Can you tell the Conservative leader of Carlisle City Council, can people trust Boris Johnson to tell the truth?
You know what? He's still delivering across the north of England. The people who voted him in, those red wall voters who've been let down by Labour for so long.
What's he delivered on? People's taxes are going up. People's energy bills are going up. There's a cost of living crisis. In what way has Boris Johnson met the real questions from your constituents and voters?
The people in my constituency know what Boris is delivering for them, whether it be that investment in Thornaby Town Centre, whether that be the investment in Yarmouth. Like, there is huge investment in my part of the world, and there are more police on our streets, more doctors and nurses in our hospital, and actually some of those long-term projects in my part of the world, in the Red Wall, where we've been neglected by Labour for so long, we're seeing real investment.
So the Conservative leader of Carlisle City Council is wrong, in your mind, about Boris Johnson and about the losses that have been incurred?
I haven't heard from the leader of
I've told you what he said.
Yeah, well, I would be very happy to have a discussion with him. But actually, in my part of the world, we've made progress in Hartlepool. In Sunderland, Labour has also fallen back. So from where I sit and where I look out, where we are delivering locally for people, we're getting really good results.
Right. I mean, should Boris Johnson apologise, or would you like to apologise to all those hard-working councillors that you've just talked about who've lost their seats overnight and those councils that have gone?
I am bitterly disappointed for each and every one of them. I'm delighted for the two that we gained in Hartlepool last night, and I'll be out there helping them get across the line and deliver in their part of the world. Of course, we're disappointed to lose councils. In fact, I feel sorry for the residents in those councils who have enjoyed fantastically low council tax for years. The lowest council tax.
Well, it wasn't enough, but it wasn't enough. If you were going to suggest one change that the Conservative Party should make following these results and the losses of those councils, what would it be?
I think, do you know what? During the last 2 years, we've had some distractions. We've been able to get our message across. We've been able to talk about all the great things that we're doing in communities like mine. And hopefully, going forward, we're going to be able to get on with that. Because people like you are going to start talking to me about what we're delivering instead of about Partygate and birthday cakes, with a bit of luck, eh?
Well, I haven't mentioned it actually so far, but you have. But thank you very much, Matt Vickers, there. Joining me now from Belfast is our correspondent, Dan Johnson. Dan, we're not going to get, I don't think, many results while I'm here in the chair in the studio, but this is extremely important for Northern Ireland, probably the most consequential part of these elections in many ways, because Sinn Féin has been tipped at becoming the largest party in history. How's it looking?
Yeah, it's early days. The voting, the counting has only just begun here in the last hour or so. There are 3 count centres across Northern Ireland, with the results not expected to start coming in until around lunchtime. Then through this afternoon, it'll probably take into the evening, perhaps into the early hours of tomorrow morning, to get a clear picture of exactly where the parties stand and who has come out as the biggest party. The DUP has held that position certainly in the last few years, but the polls have consistently shown in the last few weeks and months that Sinn Féin is leading and is expected to take that position as the biggest party, which would then entitle them to the First Minister position in the Stormont executive. Now, whether in practicality the DUP or the other perhaps biggest unionist party would take up power sharing with Sinn Féin is a major question. The DUP pulled out of power sharing here in February in opposition to the Northern Ireland Protocol, the way that the trade rules were hitting trade in Northern Ireland, and they've said they won't go back into power sharing without amendments to the Northern Ireland Protocol. But unionists would also find it difficult to share power with a Sinn Féin First Minister, given Sinn Féin's long-stated intent for a united Ireland. So this could be a major step in that direction, but Sinn Féin has been playing that down in this campaign, in this election, saying that this is about local issues, about the cost of living, about energy prices, and that this is not the time to determine Northern Ireland's constitutional position. But certainly there are major issues at play. It's a complicated voting system. Proportional representation is at play, so it takes a bit of time to work out exactly how the seats are shared amongst the different parties. And one thing to look out for is that turnout looks like it will be down on 5 years ago. The estimates last night were that turnout was at around 54-55% an hour before the polls closed. It may be a bit up from that, but it looks like it'll be below the 64-65% of 2017, which may favour the cross-community parties. We may see them doing better in this election, which may be an indication of the old divides being perhaps thrown off by some of the younger electorate here in Northern Ireland as people focus on other issues, aren't determined in their politics by those old issues of whether Northern Ireland is part of the Union or part of a united Ireland. But it is that question that people are looking out for, it potentially taking a step towards, if indeed Sinn Féin do come out on top.
Right, well, Dan, as you say, there's a lot at stake. It's looking busy behind you, despite what you're saying that perhaps turnout may be slightly down. What is the mood? Because you outlined for us very comprehensively the issue of power sharing. Because when I listened and watched the debate with the party leaders in Northern Ireland earlier in the week, Jeffrey Donaldson, the DUP, would not be committed to saying that he would go back into power sharing unless and until the Northern Ireland Protocol that guides the trading arrangements as part of the Brexit Treaty was changed or perhaps got rid of altogether, of which there is no sign of that happening. So what is the mood?
That has been the DUP's fierce opposition, particularly in the last year or so. It's why power sharing became fragile last summer. It's why the DUP is on its third leader in the space of a year. It's why power sharing collapsed in February and why the DUP has said it will not resume power sharing unless there are significant amendments to the way that the Northern Ireland Protocol operates, the way it is hitting, in Unionists' view, business here in Northern Ireland. But then Sinn Féin is supportive of the protocol, says there are economic opportunities here for Northern Ireland because of the status that it now enjoys with those post-Brexit trade rules. So a lot of complicated issues at play. It's going to be fascinating to watch how people fall in terms of their level of support on the core issue of Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom or a united Ireland, how those issues around the protocol and trade in Northern Ireland are going to play out, and whether there is just a general dissatisfaction with the old parties, the old ways of politics here in Northern Ireland, because we've seen government essentially collapse again in the last few months. We've seen inaction on a number of the core issues that many parties say people need to be addressed. The state of the health service here in Northern Ireland is a major priority that lots of people feel isn't getting the attention and the progress that it deserves because of these other political and constitutional questions. And there is a certain level of dissatisfaction with both the major parties. That's why we may see some more support for those cross-community and other parties. It may well be that both the big parties actually lose seats, but the question could be which one loses more.
Dan Johnson there in Belfast for us. Thank you very much. I'm sure we will be returning there throughout the morning. Let's take a pause and time to look at the weather with Matt Taylor. Matt.
Hello. It's been a wet morning.
Hello, this is BBC News with me, Jo Coburn. The headlines. In local elections in England, the Conservatives suffer a series of significant losses in London, but across the country, Labour are only making modest gains.
We've had some difficult results, and you can see that in London. I would say, though, that we are mid-term, and it's quite a mixed picture, because you look elsewhere, whether that's in Hartlepool or Nuneaton or Thurrock, we've actually made gains.
And believe you me, this is a big turning point for us. From the depths of 2019, that general election, back on track.
Elsewhere, the Liberal Democrats and Greens are making gains. In Hull, the Liberal Democrats won control of the council from Labour. Counting is getting underway for the local elections in Scotland and Wales, and also in Northern Ireland, where voters have been having their say over forming a new government. And in other news, the UN says a new convoy is heading to the Ukrainian city of Mariupol in an attempt to rescue scores of civilians trapped underground with little food or water. Welcome to our continuing coverage of the election results across the UK. So far, it's been a mixed picture for all the parties. In England, the Conservatives have lost control of 3 symbolic London councils, Westminster, Barnet and Wandsworth, to Labour. The Liberal Democrats and Greens have also made gains across England. Counting has only just begun in council elections across Scotland and Wales and in Northern Ireland, where voters have been electing members of the Stormont Assembly. So here's the state of play for the parties. Let's take a look here. You can see 75 of 146 councils declared, as we've just been discussing. Labour have taken those 3 totemic London councils from the Conservatives, so plus 3, they're on 37. They've lost 1 to the Liberal Democrats, who you can see have gained. Overall, Conservatives have lost 6 councils and are on 18. And hung councils, the number of those in no overall control, have gone up 2 to 16. Let's just show you, because we were talking earlier with Chris Curtis about the baseline of 2018. You can see here England change since 2018 of key wards, 470 of the 738 declared. Just as Chris was saying, there's a sort of a slight drop overall for Labour, 0.4%, a bigger drop for the Conservatives of minus 4%. Liberal Democrats have added 1 percentage point. As you can see there, the Greens are plus 1. UKIP have gone down to 2%, losing councillors. Chris, you really gave us that sort of summary earlier on. In terms of what the Labour Party would have to do now to try and build that support, Conservative MP just earlier in a former Red Wall seat, saying they're still not doing well enough in those Red Wall areas.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think Labour's still got a big task to do, and I don't think anybody you spoke to in the Labour Party would disagree with that. I mean, if you look at opinion polls at the moment, the majority of voters who we speak to say that they don't think Labour is ready for government. A majority of voters that we speak to don't think Keir Starmer is currently a Prime Minister in waiting. We've seen, whatever question you ask, whether it's trust on the economy, who would make the best Prime Minister, who you trust on crime, we see the people who say something, pick the Conservatives or the Conservative option in those questions go down quite dramatically, but only modest rises for the Labour Party, which is basically what we've seen again in these election results tonight. So I think what the Labour Party needs to do is not just sweep up a little bit because the Conservative people are disillusioned with the Conservatives, but also actually make people want to positively vote for the Labour Party and what the Labour Party has to offer. That's the task that they've got in front of them over the next couple of years.
Now, who former Conservative voters are blaming? Boris Johnson, the issue of parties, cost of living is clearly the biggest issue of all, and people's taxes have just gone up and energy bills are continuing to rise. Aren't these the sorts of things that will really make Conservatives think, is Boris Johnson still a winner?
I mean, look, the cost of living crisis is the biggest issue that voters tell us, top of their mind at the moment, top of the mind when they were voting yesterday. The cost of living cannot be understated as an issue when it comes to voters at the moment, and I think when it comes to the sort of setup and the run-up to the next general election. I think the difficulty for the Conservatives is I'm not really sure what the plan is. When we've seen the Conservatives fall behind in the past, so in the 2010 to 2015 Parliament, we understood what the plan is, right? We came here on mornings like this, we said disappointing results for the Conservatives, but it's mid-term, the Conservatives have got an economic plan that they're hoping will turn things around before the next general election. When the Conservatives fell behind in that sort of 2017 to 2019 Parliament, they replaced their leader and they changed their strategy in order to get it back. At this stage, I can't really see what the Conservative plan is to turn this around. So when we're seeing opinion polls showing Labour ahead in the polls, and again, that's roughly what we saw last night as well, when you expected to see a cost of living crisis, people in this country getting a lot poorer, the economy, the figures out yesterday were pretty bad. What I don't really understand is, in that situation, what's the Conservative strategy in order to go from being behind in the polls at the moment to a situation where they're enough ahead in the polls at the next general election in order to get a majority government? I don't know what the answer to that question is right now, and I'm not sure the Conservative Party does either.
Well, we'll be putting some of those points to Conservatives as we go through the programme this morning. But let's get the latest for now from West Yorkshire, where our correspondent Aisha Iqbal is in Wakefield. Hello to you, Aisha.
Good morning, Jo from Wakefield. Yes, the verification of votes here in Wakefield has just started the local elections. A third of the total 63 seats are being fought for here. Now, this is a Labour-controlled council. It's got a significant majority of 23. It's insurmountable today. And if we look at the wider picture for West Yorkshire, we've got 5 Labour-held councils here. The story in terms of those individual component areas, which includes Leeds, Calderdale, Bradford and Kirklees, is a little bit different in each. Potentially we could have a story developing in Leeds where there's a Labour majority of 7, and as early as 2010 there was a Lib Dem and Conservative coalition there. So things could change there. Kirklees is a bit of a tight edge one for Labour. They're a minority control there, so that could be interesting. They would need 4 votes there to have a majority. Here in Wakefield, as I say, it's insurmountable, the actual Labour majority that they have. 21 seats, as I say, being contested. 15 of those are currently held by Labour, 5 by the Tories. So potentially the Tories could be wiped out with those 5 seats today, and that could cause a serious dent for them in terms of the wider picture. Now, in some ways, Jo, what's going to happen after the count is finished here is going to be the real story here. We're going to be finishing around 5:30, the final declaration of the results. Wakefield is a seat that was a parliamentary seat that was Labour held for 87 years, a real heartland. There's a by-election looming though, Jo. So pretty much before the ink has dried on the paperwork here, the campaigners are going to be out again on the by-election trail. Imran Ahmed Khan, the former sitting MP, has resigned after his conviction for a historic sexual assault. So campaigning is going to start very soon. And speculation really around who could be brought in as a candidate there. We know for Labour that Ed Balls, former Labour heavyweight, who used to be the MP for Morley and Atwood just down the road here, has ruled himself out. Some names being suggested to me, grassroots kind of Conservative names in the local associations who could put their names in the mix. Really, we're waiting for confirmation on that. However, in terms of the issues on the ground, in terms of what people on the doorstep are telling the campaigners, the cost of living crisis, we keep hearing it again and again, that's the key thing. But also, when in 2019 the parliamentary seat was snatched by the Tories from Labour, it was the trust in Boris, it was the Brexit bounce, as we call it, that was the winning factor. That seems to have dissipated a little bit. The trust seems to have been dissipated. And in many ways, this is seen as a litmus test, this local election, a bit of a referendum on the trust that people have on the national leaders, on Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer, and neither coming away really with glory from the doorstep here. So that trust needs to be brought back. One thing to mention, Jo, there was another by-election here in Wakefield, in West Yorkshire just last year, the Batley and Spen by-election. Kim Ledby, to the sister of Jo Cox, won that by just 322 votes. The Conservatives came very close to snatching that very traditional Labour seat. Could that story play out again here? There is a lot of trust to be rebuilt with the communities. It's about levelling up, it's about regeneration, it's about investing in local transport. These are the things that local people here want to see, but ultimately it is about that trust in the main leadership.
Aisha Iqbal, thank you very much there in Wakefield in West Yorkshire. And as Aisha has been saying, of course, all eyes will soon turn on that upcoming by-election, which Labour will be very much hoping to take back from the Conservatives. Let's get a little more detailed analysis of the results so far. We can cross the newsroom to Lewis Goodall at the touch screen. Lewis, any update?
Well, Jo, we haven't had any more counts in yet, but as you say, counting is resuming in lots of places in England, getting underway in Scotland and Wales. But in terms of the results we have had, I thought it might be instructive to have a look at, and in some ways I don't like this phrase, but it's a bit imprecise, it's a bit inexact, but the so-called red wall. It's what everyone's been talking about pretty much in politics since 2019. Before we do, and as a point of comparison, let's just take a look, given that Keir Starmer has been there this morning and chosen to go there, let's just look at Barnet. Now, I think this is an important victory for Labour. All of the results, as we've been talking about in London, are important. There's an important symbolic victory, though, as well, because actually Labour, there was some suggestion back in 2018 that Labour might win this. They didn't. One of the reasons they almost certainly didn't is because of the anti-Semitism crisis that was taking place in the Labour Party at that time. Barnet, a very Jewish area of London, the most Jewish borough in the country, I think, and you meant that Labour didn't take the seat. But this time, they've romped home. 12 gains against 12 losses. Also important because of the parliamentary seats which are in Barnet. 3 potentially marginal seats, each a bit more or less marginal than the other. There is Chipping Barnet, Theresa Villiers' seat, majority of about 1,000. There's Hendon, classic swing marginal seat. Mike Freer's seat, about 3,000 or 4,000 majority, I think. That, again, if Labour is going to really be looking for a majority sort of seat it needs. On outside chance, there is also Finchley and Golders Green, again, a very Jewish seat. If Labour were to match this sort of recovery, maybe that seat could be in play. As I say, it would be a very symbolic one, given where the Labour Party has been over the last few years. But of course, then you leave London, and it gets a bit more hazy. So you go to somewhere like, there have been other, reasonable good news stories for Labour. You go to somewhere like Chorley. Of course, this is the Speaker's seat, Lindsay Hoyle's seat. So as long as he's there, Labour can't really compete for it. But nonetheless, this is a classic Conservative Labour marginal when it's not the Speaker's seat. And you can see there, Labour up 3, Conservatives down 3. You might consider that to be the so-called red wall. If Speaker Hoyle had been a Labour MP at the last election, he may well have lost it in the 2019 almost landslide. Dudley, again, somewhere where the Labour Party, until recently, well, relatively recently, had both seats, but certainly until 2019, had 1 seat, Dudley North, Ian Austin's old seat. Well, I mean, again, the Conservatives now have a majority there of about 11,500. Can Labour retake it? Well, they'll probably need to be doing a little bit better than just taking 2 seats back, but it is some modest progress, again, but is modest good enough? And then in some places, of course, we are seeing them go backwards. So somewhere like Oldham, a really interesting place and interesting politics of late. Last year, when these seats were up, their leader in Oldham lost their seat, the Labour leader in 2021, and again overnight in 2022, his successor has lost her seat as well, because Oldham have been going down by 5, mainly actually to independent groups. And this is a feature that you're increasingly seeing across English local politics, particularly in Labour northern areas. In places like Greater Manchester, you're seeing the rise of these independent groups eating away. Labour still have the majority here, but eating away at their majority over time. And then if we have a look at somewhere like Cumberland, well, we've talked about that just before, again, important in parliamentary terms because of the parliamentary seats there, but that's about as far as it gets. As I say, it's difficult to really chart a course, but we will have more information coming over the course of the morning and the afternoon. And 2, just to keep your eye on, Joe, Wakefield you've already talked about, important because of the glimmer, the tantalising glimmer it might give us for the upcoming by-election, which I would suggest is a must-win for Keir Starmer's leadership. And this is a really interesting one. Newcastle-under-Lyme in Staffordshire. It's a seat, it's one of the only so-called red wall boroughs where all of the seats are up for election. As you'll have seen in so many of these places, it's just a third, which makes it hard to get really good and accurate extrapolation. But all of the seats are up in Newcastle-under-Lyme. The Conservatives took it last time. It had at a parliamentary level been a Labour seat since 1919. The Conservatives also took that Arundel, the 2019 general election. That really will be, with all of those clutch of seats in Staffordshire, the Stoke-on-Trent seats and so on, that the Conservatives really astonishingly took at the last election. There will be a lot of Conservative MPs in that part of the West Midlands keeping a very close eye on that result. So one to watch out for over the course of the afternoon, Joe.
Lewis, before I let you go, as you say, we're getting results in all the time. I mean, there is this issue, of course, that the baseline, as you said earlier, is 2018 when these seats were last contested in England. And also that in most cases outside London, it's a third of the seats that are actually being contested and won and lost.
Yeah, and it does make it difficult. Look, these seats were always going to be difficult necessarily to get really good extrapolations or analyses from. Why? Well, they're so London-centric. The majority of the seats in England being contested are in London. We know that the Labour Party does very well in London, that London has been trending towards the Labour Party over time. We've seen that again and again over the course of the last 24 hours. Outside of London, it's a real patchwork of the sort of places that are up. As you say, some are in thirds, some aren't. But as I say, this is the sort of, what if we're looking for a trend, what we can say is that the Labour Party, I think I can actually show you here to give you a bit more of a sort of global view of it. If you're looking for a trend, what you can say, again, Labour Party doing better than they did in 2018 in London. They already did pretty well in 2018 in London under Jeremy Corbyn, but doing better still. The Conservatives doing really, really badly. They are in danger of becoming something of an endangered species in London. They only had 7 councils going into these elections. They'll have far fewer than that coming out of it. Their only council in inner London will be Kensington and Chelsea. Now they've lost Westminster and they lost Wandsworth as well. But in the north of England, it's a different story. Labour Party actually going backwards on Jeremy Corbyn's performance in 2018. The Conservative going backwards as well. And actually the main beneficiaries in the north of England, Lib Dems have actually done all right better in other parts of the country. We can perhaps talk about that a bit later, particularly in the south of England. But the Greens doing well, and the Independents doing as well. So you can see it is a mixed picture. We keep using that phrase, but it is a good way of describing the results that we've had so far. And I think the truth is there's something in it for everyone in these results. There's something for the Labour Party. They can say we're doing better than we did in 2019, doing better than we did in 2021. The Conservatives can say, well, we're not doing as badly as you might expect we might, given the circumstances, given the fact that we're 12 years in. And so in that sense, both parties will have something to comfort themselves with and something to worry about as well.
Oh, well, thank you very much for that analysis, Lewis Goodall there. Chris, let's just pick up on Scotland. We haven't got results coming in at the moment. Counting is starting. Of course, it is a proportional system there too, so it probably will take a little bit more time. 16 and 17-year-olds are able to vote. But the important indicator from polling has been that Labour could leapfrog the Conservatives, who performed very well last time in 2017 when all the councils were contested, and they may leapfrog them to second place. But how much impact will they make or could they make against the SNP?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it would now be a surprise if the Labour Party don't end up in second place this evening. Today, when the results are counted from the votes that were, I haven't slept. I don't know what time it is.
We'll get you some coffee.
We're expecting the Labour Party to come in second place in Scotland. It would be a surprise if they don't. The Conservatives, I think it's fair to say, have run a pretty difficult local election campaign in Scotland. For one thing, they didn't know whether they backed the Conservative Prime Minister or not.
Well, no, Douglas Rodd, their leader, did literally an about turn, didn't he?
Yes, changed stance halfway through. And look, Labour has gone back into second place in the polls in Scotland for the first time in about half a decade. That's quite significant, and I think it's going to be a really important dynamic as we head into the next general election, that actually a lot of these battles that were freeway battles before are now a lot more likely to be Labour and SNP battles. And this is significant, and this is really significant because there's a general consensus that Labour can't win a general election or a majority in a general election without some level of fight back in Scotland. Now, what we might be seeing today, potentially, is the first signs of a Labour fight back in Scotland. Maybe it's still very, very far away from that period when they dominated Scotland and won all the seats there. But it might just be those early signs that actually they're getting into second place and starting to take some votes back off the SNP while sweeping up the unionist vote and making it clear that they're the main unionist party, so taking down the Conservatives as well.
And of course, the big constitutional question is still the issue of a second independence referendum. The SNP say they have a mandate. They will continue to have a mandate probably after these election results. And Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, has clearly set out that she wants to see and hold that referendum, certainly by the end of next year, 2023. But no sign of the government, who have to give permission in this sense for it to happen.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I think what Labour's going to try and do in this argument in Scotland is they're going to have the Conservatives going, we don't want a referendum. They're going to have the SNP going, we want a referendum. That's the most important issue to us. Labour's hoping they can come in through the middle and say, you can argue about a referendum as much as you like. Here's our solution to the cost of living crisis. And I think that's Labour's plan for Scotland. Now, there might be some signs in the local election results today that that's working. But I think it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out. And as I say, I think that we might be starting to see some very early signs of a Labour fight back in Scotland.
Chris Curtis from Opinium, thank you very much for keeping me company this past hour. Now, in other news, in Ukraine. This is BBC News. I'm Jo Coburn. The headlines at 10. In local elections in England, the Conservatives suffer some big losses in London, but across the country, Labour only make modest gains.
We've had some difficult results, and you can see that in London. I would say, though, that we are mid-term, and it's quite a mixed picture because you look elsewhere, whether that's in Hartlepool or Nuneaton or Thurrock, we've actually made gains.
And believe you me, this is a big turning point for us. From the depths of 2019, that general election, back on track.
Elsewhere, the Liberal Democrats and Greens are making gains. In Hull, the Liberal Democrats won control of the council from Labour. Counting is getting underway for the local elections in Scotland and Wales, and also in Northern Ireland, where voters have been having their say over forming a new government. And in other news, the UN is attempting a new rescue mission in the Ukrainian city of Mariupol, where scores of civilians are trapped underground with little food or water. Good morning and welcome to BBC News with continuing coverage of the election results across the UK. So far, it's been a mixed picture for all the parties. In England, the Conservatives have lost control of three flagship London councils, Westminster, Barnet and Wandsworth, to Labour. The Liberal Democrats and Greens have also made gains across England. Counting has begun in council elections across Scotland and Wales and in Northern Ireland, where voters have been electing members of the Stormont Assembly. So here's the state of play for the parties. You can see here 75 of the 146 councils in England declared, and Labour, as you've heard, have gained 3, taking their tally to 37. The Conservatives have lost 6. Taking their total down to 18. The Liberal Democrats have added 1, taking a council, Hull, indeed, from Labour, and residents and the Greens have none. Hung councils, the number of no overall control has gone up to 16. Our political correspondent, Helen Catt, has the story so far.
A symbolic win for Labour. Wandsworth in South London, Tory for 44 years, until now. Even in an election about local services, having the lowest council tax in the country didn't keep it blue.
The cost of living crisis did come up, as did the massive cuts from the government since 2010, and also Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was a vote winner for Labour, as indeed was Keir Starmer as well. And I remind you, Hugh, in 1998, a year after our landslide victory, we didn't win this seat in Wandsworth. In 2002, a year after our landslide victory in 2001, we didn't win this seat in Wandsworth, and we've done it in 2022.
Wandsworth's former leader blamed the loss on the cost of living and said what he called the issue of Boris Johnson was raised. That was echoed by some Tory councillors elsewhere.
It's Partygate, it's not just Partygate. There's the integrity issue. Basically, I just don't feel people any longer have the confidence that the Prime Minister can be relied upon to tell the truth.
In a surprising upset, the Conservatives lost Westminster Council to Labour, as well as Southampton and Barnet in North London, where the Labour leader went to mark the result.
This is a massive turning point for the Labour Party. From the depths of 2019, we're back on track now for the general election, showing what the change that we've done, the hard change we've done in the last 2 years, what a difference it has made.
Others maintain things aren't as bad as they could be for the Tories.
We've had some difficult results, and you can see that in London. I would say, though, that we are mid-term, and it's quite a mixed picture because you look elsewhere, whether that's in Hartlepool or Nuneaton or Thurrock, we've actually made gains. And I think if you take the whole picture of this, it really doesn't demonstrate that Labour has the momentum to form the next government.
Labour won the newly created Cumberland Council in the northwest, but is not expecting big gains, and it's had losses too. The Liberal Democrats, who've had a strong night, took Hull Council from it.
And what was really interesting about last night's results, in places like Wimbledon and Cheadle and elsewhere, we were winning seats where we need to win seats in the next general election. So it was a great night for those councillors.
The Greens too have made gains. Also overnight in Bristol, voters chose to scrap their mayor in a referendum. This is all only a partial picture. Almost half of England's councils have yet to start counting and will do so later today. So too will all of the councils in Wales and Scotland. And counting will start for all 90 seats in the Northern Ireland Assembly, with polls suggesting that Sinn Féin could become the largest party for the first time. Helen Catt, BBC News.
Let's get some more detailed analysis with Lewis Goodall. He is at the touch screen. Lewis, we're going to be talking to Yvette Cooper, the Shadow Home Secretary, shortly. She's in Wakefield, part of the Northwest. Take us through the importance of the former Red Wall, as we used to call it.
Well, Jo, should we start with just defining what the Red Wall is? Because there may be people who aren't total politics obsessives, and who can blame them, who aren't sure or haven't heard of the term, because of course, in essence, it doesn't really mean anything at all. It was a term that came along in the 2019 general election to describe the ribbon, really, of unbroken red stretching across, largely, though not exclusively, the north of England. Seats that had been Labour, often for generations. We were talking about Newcastle-under-Lyme before. You mentioned Hartlepool just now, the Stoke-on-Trent seats. Many of these places, as I say, Wakefield, another of them, many had not been Conservative for at least a generation. Boris Johnson won them, mainly, very strongly, Leave voting areas, and that was essentially where the 2019 general election was won and lost. It was the election where our political geography changed. And Keir Starmer's big pitch when he was running to be Labour leader was, I'm the man who can recover the Red Wall. I can get Labour back in action. All of those seats that it has such a romantic attachment to, the sort of places where in many ways the Labour Party was born. Well, this is the Labour performance in these elections, the 2022 elections, in the Red Wall. And I want you to notice something. This is comparing the change, not with the 2019 general election, but with the 2018 local elections, because that's the only thing that's fair to compare it to. The last time that these seats were contested. And you can see, in the high Leave voting areas, the Labour Party is pretty much treading water, down by 0.5%. The Conservatives down by 3%. The other parties making up the difference. In the Conservative general election gains of 2019, compared to how they voted in the local elections of 2018, again, it's called nip and tuck. Labour Party up 1%, Conservatives down 1%. Now, there's two ways of looking at that, and that is the battle, I think, for the narrative of these election results, at least so far. The one way of looking at that is to say, well, hang on a minute, the Labour Party is doing very, very badly indeed. They're treading water. They're supposed to be making progress in these places. But that would be true if we were comparing it with the 2019 performance. But we're not, are we? We're comparing it to the 2018 performance. And what the Labour Party would say is that in 2018, the Red Wall hadn't collapsed. It wasn't necessarily in the rudest of health everywhere, but it hadn't collapsed. And so their argument would be, well, if we can just replicate, say, the 2018 performance, which is basically what they've done on the basis of the results we've had so far, if they can just replicate that at the next general election, then quite a few of those seats should tumble back into the Labour column, going quite a way to provide Keir Starmer with the majority, or at least the biggest party status that he so craves. But of course, it's a bit of a risk, because if you only tread water in these places, there is a risk that there are a lot of Conservative voters in these places, in these elections, who've just stayed at home. They haven't decided to go and vote for the Labour Party. They might have also voted in a protest for an independent or another group. And what happens if they go back to the polls at the next general election and actually think, you know what, in a general election, I am going to vote for Boris Johnson. I am going to vote for the Conservatives. And then all of that treading water starts to look a lot dicier.
Lewis Goodall, thank you very much for taking us through all of that. We're going to stick with many of the themes outlined there by Lewis, because we're going to talk to Labour Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper. She joins us from Wakefield. Good morning to you, Yvette. You've done well in London.
Good morning, Jo.
You've done well in London, taking those key Conservative councils, flagship councils, in fact, of Wandsworth and Westminster and Barnet. You've not done so well outside of London and in the north of England. In fact, you've lost Hull, the Council of Hull, to the Liberal Democrats. What do you make of the results overall?
Well, we've seen some strong Labour results from Cumberland down to Southampton, from the very north of the country to the very south of the country. And we do see this as a turning point for Labour, because particularly since the 2019 election, we've had a real rebuilding of support right across the country in different areas across the country. And if some of the results that we've seen in different places in the country had been replicated in a general election, in terms of the vote share that we'd got, then we would be winning dozens of constituencies back from the Conservatives, including places like Hartlepool or Workington as well. So that's really important, but we know we've got a lot of work still to do, and we're still rebuilding, and we're going to carry on doing that.
Right, you say it's a turning point, and that actually if the results so far in parts of the country were translated at a general election, you'd be winning dozens of seats. But actually, John Curtis, our elections guru, says it wouldn't be enough on the basis of what we've seen so far to build a majority for the Labour Party at a general election under Keir Starmer, and perhaps not even enough to be the largest party. That's incredibly disappointing.
Well, we started in 2019 with one of the worst results for Labour for generations. And we have had a lot of work to do to rebuild, to earn back trust. And I think that's what you've seen Labour doing across the country under Keir Starmer. We've made clear that Labour's changed and we are building support. And we've got to keep doing that. We've got to keep earning back the support for people who left us in 2019 and other people across the country who we want to support. Labour's ideas, Labour's policies, for example, on the cost of living crisis, the issue that's come up time and again on the doorstep, and the things we've put forward to cut people's energy bills. So we're going to keep doing that. But for us, I mean, having been campaigning through the 2019 election and beyond since then, we have really seen a very big turning point since then.
All right, but it's the scale of that turning point, Yvette Cooper, because Labour wants to be the party of the next government. Keir Starmer, we just heard from my colleague Lewis Goodall, said that he would recover those seats, so many of them lost across former Labour heartlands in the north of England. The results so far don't show really very much indication of that. In fact, I'm just going to show our viewers, and I'll take you through it, Yvette, the key wards analysis in England, the change since 2018 when these seats were last contested, 470 out of 738 declared. Labour have gone down by 0.4%. So you've actually gone slightly backwards. The Conservatives have gone further backwards, Lib Dems have gone up a bit and the Greens a bit more. But Labour has gone back. Tell me exactly how that shows that you're on your way back to potential government.
Because many of those areas that you're talking about, had that vote share that we've got today or yesterday in the votes been replicated in a general election, we would have won back many constituencies, including some in Wolverhampton, some in West Bromwich, some Peterborough, Stevenage, as well as the ones I referred to at the beginning about Hartlepool and Copeland as well. So constituencies that we lost in 2019 that we would now be winning back. We want to go further. We want to build more support. The tricky thing about comparing with the 2018 elections is that we had in the 2018 elections already won more than half the seats that were up. And so that means there's a limit to what you can do compared to the 2018 elections. But for us, in terms of rebuilding and getting a Labour government in place that can tackle the cost of living crisis, that can stand up for working people across the country, we have to rebuild from 2019. And we have seen, I think, a really substantial turnaround since then. And for many of us, if you talked to us straight after the 2019 election, to have heard that we would have been able to make this progress in these 2 years or just over 2 years under Keir's leadership, I think people would have not believed it could have been possible to make this progress so quickly. We have made that progress. We've got to keep making progress and keep earning back support. That's what we will keep doing.
It's modest, though. You would accept that these are modest gains, and the way it stands at the moment, you're not on course to win the next election. What does that tell you about Keir Starmer's leadership? You say he's turned it around, certainly in places in London, although the capital was already trending towards Labour, and symbolically that is important. But John Curtis, our elections guru and expert, has said that actually Labour is still struggling to make much progress in areas that voted Brexit. Do you agree with that?
But we've just been through some of the examples of Hartlepool and Copeland.
But there are as many examples. But there are as many examples where you're not making that progress.
but you're making your comparison with 2018, and the point is that in 2019, look, it was a really difficult result for us in 2019, and that wasn't just about Brexit, although that was really important for people. It was also about our leadership as well. On both of those issues, Labour has moved on now. We have a new leader. We've made clear that our approach now is to make Brexit work, and we are changing, I think, as a party. We're building as well in terms of in Barnet, for example, where we had a real problem, and it was really important to rebuild the vote and support among Jewish communities who understandably had felt very angry with Labour, and Keir has turned that around. So I think you've seen huge changes, and as a result, compared to the 2019 election, we have seen a big increase in support for Labour in a lot of those areas where we lost constituencies badly in 2019.
All right, well, let's stick with the issue of Brexit, because you yourself have said people in Leave voting areas have never heard what Labour's post-Brexit vision is, have never heard a positive Labour vision of how we can build new partnerships post-Brexit across the world. That's what Keir Starmer is going to have to do. Now, you called on him to do that a year ago. Why hasn't he done it yet?
So I think that Keir has been doing a huge amount of work on how we set forward a vision which is about making Brexit work, but is also about supporting people in the British economy. You've heard the things that Rachel Reeves, for example, has been talking about how we make, buy and sell more here in Britain. You've heard the work that Nick Thomas-Symonds, for example, has been doing about how we get better trade deals all around the world. And also, crucially, right now, when it's the cost of living crisis that is affecting people, our proposals to have a windfall tax on the gas and oil companies that have seen these record profits in the middle of this cost of living crisis, to properly tax those excess profits, put that into cutting energy bills right across the country. These are practical things. We're setting out issues about how we would get more neighbourhood police back on the streets. We've been cut so heavily since 2015, and stop this huge slide in prosecutions with criminals getting away with it. So I think across the board, Labour's been setting out different things that we would do according to Labour values, being on people's side. You are right, we have got a lot more to do, and we will keep doing that, because we want to work to earn back every possible vote, and to get votes for people who've never voted up for us before. We want them to have their trust in Labour for the future, rather than this total shambolic and shameful Conservative government that is letting people down in the middle of a cost of living crisis.
Well, you say it's a cost of living crisis. You're absolutely right. It's the number one issue for pretty well everybody, every voter on the doorstep. And people might have thought, because it's a cost of living crisis, and the Conservatives, one way or another, have been in power since 2010, and we've had the backdrop of the culture at Westminster and the issue of parties, why isn't Keir Starmer cutting through even more? Why isn't Labour doing even better and have a better showing? I accept what you've said about what happened in 2019, but the issues that the government is grappling with, you would have thought benefit you. But in fact, the Liberal Democrats seem to have done quite well, and also the Greens.
I think it's been different in different parts of the country, but I think we have seen a significant increase in Labour support in really important areas across the country compared to 2019, and some of those important councils from Cumberland to Southampton as well. But you're right, the cost of living crisis is going to get worse for people. I'm really worried about what's going to happen to people. We have one of our local Labour councillors here in Wakefield who has been literally on the phone while the count started this morning, trying to coordinate food bank parcel deliveries because people are being so heavily hit. And it's, for everybody from people who've just started a family, from mortgage holders to people on low income, everybody is being hit by the big increase in bills. That is what Labour is going to keep pressing for, proper, sensible action to tackle those problems and to help families across the country. So you're going to hear a lot more of us talking about the same things, because we think this is really important for people across Britain.
All right, well, let's hope we talk to you soon. That's the Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, there at the count in Wakefield. Jo Twyman from the polling organisation Deltapoll is here with me now. What did you make of what you heard there from Yvette Cooper? Obviously, we are sort of tussling over how much progress Labour has actually made. It looks pretty modest. Important gains in places like the capital and Southampton, for example, but certainly not universal.
Yeah, what we're hearing from Yvette Cooper is an example of the kind of stories that the parties always hope to spin the morning after the results come in. Each party will point to something that they see as a success, but the reality is that most of the time, particularly in this case, it tends to be a mixed bag. And we've certainly seen a mixed bag for Labour today. In areas like, as you talked about, in London, Barnet, Wandsworth, particularly in Westminster, to see those go to Labour is a big psychological success. But for Labour not to gain Sheffield, for instance, is the kind of place they should have and indeed would have hoped to have won. And so Yvette Cooper is presenting this as a turning point, but it may be more of a talking point. And I don't think we're quite yet at the stage where Labour can say this is the beginning of our journey towards electoral success, because the evidence is certainly not there that is the case.
Well, and Yvette Cooper's saying that Keir Starmer's leadership has detoxified the brand in parts of the country as far as she is concerned, citing the issue of anti-Semitism in places like Barnet. But around the rest of the country, as you say, Labour needs to win back, certainly seats at a general election in the north of England, and we'll come on to Scotland in just a moment. There does obviously seem to be a lot of antipathy now towards Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party, but are they embracing Labour?
Well, this is the key question going into the next election. It's all very well for people to be disappointed and dissatisfied with the Conservatives in those seats that the Conservatives gained last time that propelled them to such a large majority. But of course, the crucial question is not just whether they're voting Conservative or not. The question is whether they're deciding to turn out or not at a next general election. And what Labour may find is that those people who were previously Labour, then switched to Conservatives, now switch to simply staying at home. And in some constituencies, that will be enough to get Labour over the line. But in others, they need people to actually switch back to them if they're to secure anything approaching a majority.
What about leadership issues? Because obviously the allegations about parties and law-breaking events going on in Whitehall and Downing Street directed at Boris Johnson. We know because we've heard from some of the Conservative, some of them former council leaders talking about it, an issue of trust and integrity. In terms of Keir Starmer's leadership, is it cutting through? The specific allegations around his behaviour don't seem to have cut through very much yet. Even before both sets of allegations came out, around 1 in 10 people thought the senior Conservative members were sticking to the rules, but only a quarter thought that senior Labour members were sticking to the rules. So it wasn't the case that Labour were always seen as behaving very, very well on COVID and Conservatives were seen as very badly. But I think what resonates particularly badly with the electorate generally is the fact that the Conservatives were fined and the fact that they came up with the rules in the first place. That places things in a completely different context. Stay with us, Jo, because we're going to speak to our political editor for the West of England, Paul Baltrop. Paul, Liberal Democrats have high hopes, do they there?
Down in Somerset, the Lib Dems are, yes, optimistic. Now, Somerset is that classic two-horse race between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives. You think back to Paddy Ashdown's day, they dominated in the West Country. Somerset was their heartland. They had most of the parliamentary seats. They fell on hard times, especially after the coalition era, went badly backwards, lost all those parliamentary seats, lost control of most of the councils. Now, what's actually happening in Somerset is they are merging district councils and the county council to create one really big unitary authority. So it is a big election come what may, and it's a big moment, really big test. The Conservatives have actually run the county council level for 13 years, and they were hoping to repeat their success at this election. The Lib Dems, though, had a good district council election 3 years ago where they won 3 out of the 4 districts. That sets the scene going into this election, and really big stakes there because, yes, Somerset, with this big new council, 110 members being elected to it, really big battle between the two. And I've got to say, having been out around Somerset over the last few weeks, it was, well, sometimes hard to see the Conservatives putting up placards, posters, etc. Sometimes you talk to voters who'd say, look, I would normally vote Conservative, but not at the moment. So that was going into the election. Lib Dems obviously talking about local issues, but happy to remind voters about the trials and tribulations of Boris Johnson, Partygate, etc. And I know last night they took the ballot papers away, they verified them, locked them away. They're going to be counting today. That's just getting going in Somerset. But I heard one Lib Dem who told me that last night, feeling optimistic about how things are looking.
Paul, thank you very much. There for us in Bristol. Well, let's talk to the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Daisy Cooper. Good time to talk to you, Daisy. You've had a pretty good night, morning overall. What do you think of your prospects then down in Somerset?
Well, as you say, we have had a good night and we hope that we get some more positive results as the day goes on. I think what we saw in North Shropshire in the by-election that we won last year is that we are seeing this revival in rural areas. So we are optimistic that in places like Somerset, also Westmoreland and in North Yorkshire that we can make some more significant gains today.
Right. In terms of working with the Labour Party, you know that there have been claims that there was some sort of pact between the two of you, denied by both sides. Is it time to look at that, though? If you feel you've done reasonably well, had a strong performance, Labour saying they're back in, certainly in the capital and other parts of the country like Southampton, is it time to work together to keep the Conservatives out?
No, I don't like pacts, and I think it's because I think it's a really bad thing to tell
except
voters.
Except for the coalition you were in with the Conservatives.
Well, that was very different, wasn't it? A pact is what happens before an election and a coalition is what might happen after an election.
Right.
But I think what Liberal Democrats have shown in places like Chesham and Amersham and in North Shropshire in both of those by-elections was we didn't need to do a pact. We worked really hard to establish our position as the key challengers to the Conservatives, and voters could make up their own minds as to who they wanted to vote for. And so we've shown that in both of these areas. And in these local elections, we are fighting Labour in many places around the country, but we are also predominantly fighting the Conservatives in many of our blue wall areas, which are the areas where we want to target Conservative MPs at the next general election.
Would you enter into another coalition?
I think that's a long way off, isn't it? Let's be honest.
I don't know. The election could be next year. It looks like it'll be 2024, but there has been talk of next year. You're sounding confident. So would you rule out another coalition?
My focus right now is to speak up for the Liberal Democrats, to speak up for Liberal values and to speak out about our policies on the cost of living crisis, where we've called for a windfall tax to tackle energy bills, but also an emergency VAT cut. That's the issue that I think voters are really worried about right now. The public are very, very scared about these enormous bills that are increasing, £700 already on energy bills, potentially another £800 in the autumn. The Liberal Democrats are focused on these issues right now, and it's really frustrating that it falls to opposition parties like the Liberal Democrats to put forward these concrete ideas whilst the Conservative government sits on its hands and does nothing.
Right. Well, it's not a no, though, and I suppose you'd be foolish to rule it out completely. One of the policies you just cited was a windfall tax on oil and gas companies. That, of course, is also a Labour policy. I mean, there is quite a lot of agreement, isn't there?
Well, often if you look at the history books, you can see that there's agreement with different parties at different times in history. I think what we're focused on right now are the local elections today. Liberal Democrats are in second place to the Conservatives in 80 seats, around 80 seats around the country. And we've made no secret of the fact that we are going to focus our resources on trying to win as many seats as we can off the Conservatives. And we do think that we will play a significant role, we hope, in helping to remove Boris Johnson's Conservatives.
Now, what about the Green Party? Because obviously you champion everything around climate change and the environment. But the Greens have had a pretty good performance thus far. Are you losing votes to them?
No, I think what we can see is that the Green Party may well have had a good night, but when it comes to the really big test, what's clear is that under this voting system, the Green Party has never won a seat off the Conservatives in a general election. And it's the Liberal Democrats who can win seats off the Conservatives at a general election. It's the way our voting system works at the moment, but it's the rules under which we have to play. And that's why Liberal Democrats continue to be the key challengers to Conservatives in many places around the country.
Now, any predictions you'd like to make now? I know it's early days, and of course we haven't really had results from Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, but any predictions, any targets that we should be looking at?
Not from me, I'm afraid. I really don't like guessing at numbers and things. I think we should never take voters for granted. But I think what we can see is that there are a few surprises coming through. So I'll be watching the results come in alongside you, and we'll see what happens.
All right, Daisy Cooper, their deputy leader of the Liberal Democrats. Before I move on, Jo, it's interesting, isn't it, this idea of coalition? You might argue that the Liberal Democrats, it's taken this length of time to actually detoxify their brand following that coalition, even though they said they were very successful partners in it with the Conservatives. But Daisy Cooper not ruling it out, obviously, again in the future.
No, inevitably not. You talked about the recovery of the Lib Dems. For the last 7 years, really, they've been in the political wilderness. They'll be hoping to recover in the areas like the southwest, where previously they were strong. And that could be crucially important come the next election, because Labour do not need to win a majority to keep Boris Johnson and the Conservatives out of Downing Street. They just need to prevent the Conservatives winning that majority, and then they will hope to form some sort of coalition, or however you characterise it, partnership of some form, with potentially the SNP, the Lib Dems and whoever else, to get Keir Starmer into number 10.
I mean, do you think one of the stories that will come out of this set of elections is that the Conservatives are holding on to many of the gains that they made in those former Labour strongholds in the East Midlands and in the north of England? But actually, the threat is growing in the south, not just London, but in the south of England and the southwest, in the way you have described, losing traditional Tory shire areas to the Liberal Democrats. And Boris Johnson's going to struggle to hold them both.
Yes, there's a lot of focus, quite rightly, on what people call the red wall, but what the Lib Dems called the blue wall, this area of Remain-leaning Conservative seats, is a prime electoral battleground come next time around. And so it's inevitable that in those areas of the south, the Lib Dems will want to pick up, and of course Labour will want to pick up as well. So we've seen successfully in Southampton. Portsmouth stayed at no overall control, so perhaps Labour or the Lib Dems would have wanted to take that. But it demonstrates that there's a whole lot of difference in this country, and a lot of it is still around Brexit, or at least what Brexit represents.
Yes, demographics are definitely changing, aren't they? Let's get the picture from Birmingham, from our Midlands political editor, Elizabeth Glinker. Hello to you, Elizabeth. Bring us up to date.
Hi Jo, yes, welcome to Birmingham. The count got underway here about 45 minutes ago. Now, we've been talking about a lot of the big metropolitan boroughs only being up by thirds this time. That's not the case here in Birmingham. We have all-out elections across the city. It's the biggest council in the country, 101 seats across 69 wards. And as you can see behind me, it's a pretty huge undertaking, so we're not expecting results until later into this afternoon. This council has been run by Labour for the last 10 years. Prior to that, it was a Conservative Lib Dem coalition. Now, the Labour Party saying 2018 for them was a really great year. It was kind of a high watermark. So they will be kind of satisfied if they hold on to that position here in the city of Birmingham. And to be honest, we are not expecting big shifts here. We expect Labour to retain their majority and for things to be pretty much as they were. But there is some interest in seeing whether there could be in some parts of the city a resurgence for the Liberal Democrats, who, as I said, in the past have helped run this council with the Conservatives. So it'll be interesting to watch that, and also whether the Greens can make any progress here. Elsewhere in the West Midlands region, there has been a lot of focus on those former red wall seats in the Black Country, the big urban areas just outside of Birmingham. And because they were up by thirds, I'm afraid to say, I keep telling people this, we weren't expecting to see huge shifts. We weren't expecting, simply the maths meant that Labour wasn't going to sweep in and take control back of some of the councils like Dudley and Walsall. Just to give you an update on some of the results we have had overnight, Labour retained control in Wolverhampton as expected, and in Coventry. Dudley very much still in Conservative control. That's one of those areas that really went blue in terms of parliamentary votes as well. But Labour having their best result there since 2016. So maybe a few little green shoots for the Labour Party in Dudley. And in Sandwell as well, this is an interesting one. West Brom, the old former stomping ground of Tom Watson, the former Labour deputy leader. Now that area now has 3 out of 4 of its MPs. They're Conservatives. Now, and in last year's local elections, from a position of 0, the Conservatives took 9 seats on Sandwell Council. Now, talking to the Conservatives in the run-up to this election, they were still thinking they could make gains in Sandwell. As it turns out, that is not the case. So we're still in the same position there, and I don't know, Labour may look upon that as being some kind of positive news, because the Conservatives have, maybe that Conservative tide has been stemmed in those areas. In other parts of the region, we have had a really interesting result in Worcester overnight. That council, which was being run by the Conservatives with a majority of just one after they took 4 seats from Labour in last year's local elections, has now gone back to no overall control. Some success for the Greens there, and we know that Labour and the Greens are going to be chatting about potentially running that in coalition over the weekend. So the Greens having the balance of power on that council. That's an interesting thing to see, the growth of the Green vote, particularly in some of the more rural parts of the West Midlands. And finally, another interesting result, Nuneaton, which a little bit different in terms of the kind of people that Nuneaton and Bedworth, this is in North Warwickshire. It's much closer to the kind of Red Wall in terms of the people, the voters there. The Conservatives doing much better there. They actually took a seat from Labour overnight. So really, I would have to say, a bit of a mixed picture. Some potential good news for Labour in some areas, but certainly not a massive sweeping in, a massive changing of the guard here in the West Midlands.
Oh, Elizabeth Glinker there in Birmingham. Thank you very much for taking us through, yes, what is, as you say, a very mixed picture. I'm sure we'll go back to you later on when there are some more results. Now, welcome to our continuing coverage of the election results across the UK. As I said, it has been a mixed bag for all the parties. In England, the Conservatives have lost control of those 3 flagship London councils, Westminster, Barnet and Wandsworth. Labour have taken those. The Liberal Democrats and the Greens have also made gains across England, and counting has now begun in those council elections. All the councils are out in Scotland and Wales and in Northern Ireland. Voters there are electing members to the Stormont Assembly, and that could be a very big result when we have everything in. But let's have a look at the state of play for the parties in England. Just to remind you, 76 of 146 councils declared. The number of councillors for Labour are up 33 to 12, just over 1,200. For the Conservatives, it's a loss of 120. The Lib Dems have gained 58 councillors. Independents haven't gained anything. They're on 40, residents the same. The Greens have added 23, bringing their total to 39. Jo Twyman, again, the pictures we heard there from Birmingham and the Midlands, very difficult to tell exactly what each of the main parties can take away from this. The cost of living is the key issue for everybody on the doorstep. Taxes going up. Inflation figures are soaring, and the Bank of England worryingly hinting that it could be recession by the end of the year. But it doesn't look yet as if we're seeing a clear picture of where voters are putting their trust overall.
Yes, it is a mixed picture, as inevitably these local elections tend to be. You can always point to something that's good news, and there'll probably be a fair bit of bad news as well for each party. The Conservatives came out from the very beginning talking about how they were looking at a bad night, and they knew that the cost of living was important. They knew that that Partygate had damaged their position in the polls, and they could see the polls that have shown a Labour lead nationally, of course, although not the whole nation is voting, for some weeks now. But the question is where we go from here. Labour want to present this as the beginning of their journey towards Downing Street. The Conservatives want to present this as a great reset and as an opportunity to start again. But the difficulty that they have is that the cost of living crisis, really for many people, has only just begun. 9 out of 10 people have seen their cost of living rise in the last few months. But 8 out of 10 worry that it's going to rise further in the coming months. And if you couple that with all the difficult economic indicators that are coming in, it presents a difficult position for the Conservatives, because economic management, historically at least, has been so important in determining who people vote for in a general election.
Let's talk about Boris Johnson's leadership briefly, because a few months ago, there were all sorts of questions about his fate. We know letters of no confidence have gone in from a number of Conservative MPs. We, of course, don't know exactly how many. Some have been taken out since the war in Ukraine began. It has changed somewhat, but one of the factors has been that there isn't, it seems, an obvious successor for Conservative MPs unhappy with Boris Johnson to coalesce around. And that's still the case.
Absolutely. We were never going to have the situation that Boris Johnson was going to turn up on the steps of Downing Street this morning and say, I'm resigning as Prime Minister because the Conservatives lost Wandsworth. It just doesn't work like that. And the Conservatives still have the motive to replace him, but what they don't have is the replacement. Rishi Sunak polls the highest in terms of the public's choice to replace him at 11%. 52% of people say they don't know. There is no obvious successor, and in the absence of that, it's difficult to see how change would take place.
All right, stay with us. We're joined now by Amelia Womack, who's Deputy Leader of the Green Party. Welcome to you, Amelia. We were just talking earlier, describing to viewers that you've added on a fairly reasonable number of councillors to your tally. One might say that's unsurprising, bearing in mind climate change and the environment is the number one issue for many, many people. Do you think you could be doing better?
Well, we've always, throughout today, we will see the results coming in and we will be improving from here. And what we're seeing is that people are seeing our policies, seeing what we can do and working to ensure that we're getting that green representation that we truly deserve. Year upon year, we've been beating expectations, and I expect that to continue on to the next few years and even into the next general election. We've been proving that we can beat first past the post in these elections, and that is only set to continue.
Right. I mean, if we look at the performance so far of left and centre-left parties in England, the Liberal Democrats have gained the most seats, around 60. Labour have gained just over 30 seats. And as I've said, the Greens, have gained 23 seats. So it is a mixed picture. I must find another form of words of saying mixed picture on the left of politics in England. Do you accept that in terms of a general election, if the left-wing vote is split between all these parties, it's probably going to give the Conservatives another 5 years of power?
I actually think it's not about left and right at this point, because when I've been talking to people on doorsteps, what they've been saying is that they've been failed by the other parties. And what they've seen is that Greens have been working hard in their communities. There is no such thing as safe seats anymore, only safe voters. And people are questioning if they are a safe voter. So looking onto that bigger picture, we need to be winning those arguments about the kind of future that we can create.
Sure.
And we need to be making sure that there's a green vision for that future for those people that are looking for an alternative.
Right, but if
so
you
I think
want to get
hard work is what's going to capture people's imaginations, as well as that vision for the future that means that we are putting policies in place that makes a better country for our generation and generations to come.
But what you want, of course, is to get some of those policies actually into government or have some sort of representation. The Greens, of course, working with the SNP in Scotland. When it comes to the idea of some sort of electoral pact or agreement, something similar to perhaps is in existence in Scotland, is that something that you would embrace?
I mean, we've talked about working with other parties in the past and have actually led on that. But right now what we're talking about is the fact that we can win, and we're proving that we can win. And so right now, what's important is that we're building from these council results into the general election and ensuring that we're getting more Greens elected. Because I talk to people across the country and they believe that there should be more than one Green MP to tackle the biggest issues of our time.
But there hasn't been.
Ensure that
but
we
Amelia,
have that
the track record is that Caroline
voters.
Lucas has been there very lonely in Parliament for many, many years and many elections. So while you're adding council seats, you haven't added any seats in a general election, any parliamentary seats. I mean, I've just spoken to Daisy Cooper, the Liberal Democrats' deputy leader. She was very dismissive of the idea of working with the Greens. She said, in effect, the Greens aren't capable of taking seats from the Conservatives in general elections. You've never done so in the past. You have, as we know, got Caroline Lucas. What do you say to her?
Well, if you look at areas like Suffolk, where we've just increased our councillors, we are proving that we're building our foundations. We are taking those, we're chipping away at the Conservative vote there. We are, as I said, taking votes from Labour and Conservatives because people are looking for that integrity in politics that they see that they can get with the Green Party.
All right.
So yes, we are building in Conservative areas like in Suffolk and making sure that we are showing what Green representation can do there.
Okay, well,
so this is quite an exciting time for us.
Will you win more parliamentary seats at the next general election?
If we continue along this trajectory, then I don't see why we wouldn't. And as I keep saying, what we're seeing is that people are putting their faith in the Green Party. And the more that we prove that we can win, the more faith we get into those other elections, into the general election. This is an exciting time for the party. And I think that what's possible from here forward is really exciting. And that will be more seats in the general election, but more councillors across the country and increasing our vote share in other elections as well.
Will you stand to be an MP in the next election?
Will hopefully stand to be an MP. We're currently working on our general election strategy. We're currently targeting areas like Bristol West and increasing our vote share there. And we have strong and clear voices across the country about what a green future will look like that holds the government and the opposition to account.
Well, we look forward to hearing when you decide where you are going to stand as a prospective candidate. Amelia Womack there, Deputy Leader of the Green Party. Let's get some more analysis of results coming in with Lewis Goodall. He is at the touch screen. Lewis.
Yes, Joe, just having some results come in really in the last few minutes. It's from Swindon in Wiltshire. Not all of the results, as you can see, are in yet. We've got 8 of the seats in out of the 19 to be counted. Look, this has been a Conservative borough since 2003. They've been gradually expanding the Conservatives, the majority on the council right up until 2021. I think they gained 4 seats last time in 2021. But look at this. Of the results that we've had in so far from Swindon, which I say isn't all of them, the Conservatives are making further gains. 2 gains, one from Labour, one from the Lib Dems. Look, there are 2 parliamentary seats in Swindon. Swindon North, almost certainly beyond the Labour Party at the next election. Got a majority of over 12,000. Justin Tomlinson, the Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party. That's almost certainly out of reach. It was a Labour seat up until 2010, I think. But Swindon South, the constituency seat of Robert Buckland, the former Justice Secretary, well, that's got a majority of between 5,500 and 6,000. If Labour were looking to form a decent majority, it is the sort of seat that they really ought to have in their sights. And yet Swindon is another one of those places, and again, it defies a geographical analysis because we've been talking about the north and the south, and maybe Labour doing a bit better in the south, but not here. In Swindon, the Conservatives doing better. Remember, it's 55% Leave, so not overwhelmingly so, but still a Leave borough. Just worth saying, you might be wondering, well, what's going on in my neck of the woods? Well, you can actually, if you go onto the BBC News website, then you'll be able to see for yourself. You can go onto the BBC News website, just enter your postcode, as you can see there. See if you've got elections in your area in England, because of course, as we know, not all areas do, but when you do that, you'll be able to see the results where you are. Or, of course, you could just wait for us to tell you, Joe.
I'll always be waiting for you, Lewis, to keep us up to date with the latest results. Thank you very much for all of that. Let's discuss the results so far and what's to come with Anoosh Chakalian from The New Statesman. And I'm also joined by Emily Carver from Conservative Home. Welcome to both of you. Emily Carver, those losses of those flagship councils of Westminster, Wandsworth and Barnet. I mean, I never ever thought they would fall from Conservative control. I mean, they've been Conservative forever in time, it seems, and they've gone. Is that Boris Johnson to blame?
Yeah, there's no denying that Labour has had a great night in London, and the Tories have failed to keep those 3 major councils, which of course will be a massive disappointment for not only those councillors, but for the Tory party as a whole. Is it because of Boris Johnson? I imagine there are many Remainer Tories who look at Boris Johnson in a very negative light, are fed up with the sleaze allegations, the lies, what they perceive to be lies, the Partygate. Also, people aren't sure what Boris Johnson's real vision for the country is as well. So I'm sure that has lots to do with it. I also think it's an incredibly difficult time for any government at this point. On the same day as the election, of course, we heard from the Bank of England that the economy is not looking good. We've got inflation expected to reach 10%. All of this adds up. People aren't able to get GP appointments. There's a massive cost of living crisis. All of this will have added up to those losses. And I suppose for Boris Johnson, he will be hoping that those people will come back to him come a general election. And this was more a protest vote or apathy from some Tory voters who will return in the future.
I mean, Anushka, taking up on that, I mean, yes, London's been successful for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. Yvette Cooper earlier, the Shadow Home Secretary, saying in a way the brand has been detoxified in London. But that is London. Keir Starmer's got to build a coalition of seats that can win a majority at the next general election, whenever that is. So far, it's a bit anemic, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. It's a much more mixed picture in the rest of England. Of course, these symbolic victories in London, Wandsworth, Westminster, Barnet in particular, which has a very big Jewish population, these will do a lot to boost the morale of the Labour Party and make them feel that they are, in those words, detoxifying the brand, moving forward away from the Jeremy Corbyn years. And, a morale boost shouldn't be underestimated, particularly in a party that's been very used to losing in the past few years. So we shouldn't underestimate. What's important is that Labour builds more votes across the country. And actually what we're seeing is a bit of a mixed performance in the red wall areas. Having said that, victories in places like Cumberland are a big surprise and particularly significant. That's an area that covers 3 Conservative constituencies. Symbolically as well, one of those constituencies is Workington. And I'm sure a lot of your viewers will remember the Westminster obsession with Workington Man, this sort of rugby league traditional Labour voter who Labour was set to lose and the Conservatives should have been gaining. There's been a win for Labour there and in various other areas as well. Sort of gains in places like in places like Derby, Southampton, Chorley, Dudley even, which has been losing a lot of Labour support in the past few years too.
You think that Keir Starmer is cutting through enough then, and in enough places, that they could build some sort of coalition? I mean, John Curtis, our elections expert, has said at the moment they couldn't on these results so far. They would have to be winning in some of those areas that were Labour strongholds in the East Midlands, in the north of England. And of course, we've yet to see what happens in Scotland. But at the moment, do you think Keir Starmer is capitalising enough on the discomfort, Anoush, of the Conservatives with cost of living issues and the issue of the culture and parties at Westminster?
I don't think he is. I was out reporting in a ward in Wolverhampton, a red wall seat at the constituency level, which the Conservatives won from Labour overnight. So, and in that constituency, people were telling me they were really unhappy with how Boris Johnson had behaved. Partygate came up a lot. It's not just a Westminster bubble issue, but that didn't neatly translate into support for the Labour Party. In fact, the overriding sense that I got, the sentiment expressed to me from people that I was speaking to in that ward was, they're all as bad as each other. There was a real lack of enthusiasm for Keir Starmer. A lot of people hadn't heard of him, for one thing. And so I think there is a sense within the Labour Party that they haven't been capitalising on what is a particularly bad time for the Conservative Party, both within its culture and the way it does politics, but also in terms of the state that the country's in and the economy.
What needs to change, Emily? Because moving to a different part of the country, to the south of England and the southwest, the Conservatives look as if they're in some trouble. They're from the Liberal Democrats and also from the Labour Party. Anoush cited Southampton there being taken by Labour. What needs to change to win those voters back? Because, again, Boris Johnson will struggle to hold a coalition together of enough support at the next general election if he loses traditional Conservative areas in those parts of the country.
Yes, I do think, first of all, it's worth pointing out, and I think this will be true, is that many Conservative voters will not have turned out, or they will have made protest votes, as people often do in local elections, to give the government a kicking. I think the government need to commit to getting back to some of those Conservative values. They need to get that tax burden down. They need to look at the cost of living and look at how the government can make things cheaper for people rather than adding to those costs that we constantly see. It's very difficult. I mean, Keir Starmer, he is not appealing up north. He is not appealing to those Midlands, to those Labour heartlands. He may be popular in those Liberal metropolitan seats, but he is failing to capitalise on this moment where really he should be doing better than he is at this point in the election cycle.
Right. I mean, in terms of changes then, Anoosh, that Emily is citing, going back to Conservative values, perhaps a smaller state, lower taxes. I mean, that doesn't look like that's going to happen. And it also poses a difficult problem for Keir Starmer in the sense of where does he go in terms of an economic perspective, apart from better, bigger, more?
Exactly. I mean, what you'll hear from some Labour MPs and members of the shadow cabinet as well is that voters in some parts of the country that we've been talking about don't actually see Boris Johnson as a Tory. You know, they see him as one of their own, partly because he wants to spend, you know, more money than perhaps a traditional Conservative government with sort of drier economics would spend in the country. He's into really big infrastructure projects. You can see the generosity during the pandemic that helped people through that particular crisis. So if Boris Johnson gets his way and manages the economy like that, it does leave Keir Starmer with fewer places to go in terms of attack lines. They've been talking about the tax rise, but then of course, how would Labour raise its own money to spend on its own policies if it didn't raise taxes somewhere? So, it gives it a little bit less wriggle room, which makes it difficult. Having said that, I think the big challenge is within the Conservative Party. There are so many internal disagreements, angst, about what the Conservative Party actually stands for if it's raising taxes to their highest point since the 1950s. And so I think it does actually make it harder for Boris Johnson in terms of his own backbenchers than it does for Keir Starmer.
Anoosh Chakalian there from the New Statesman, Emily Carver from Conservative Home. Thank you both. We can catch up with Lewis Goodall at the touchscreen because you have results from Scotland, because they began counting a little while ago. So tell us.
Yes, Jo, we've been confined to England before now, but finally we've got our first results from north of the border. Not lots of them because they're still counting, and it's important to stress that since 2007, Scotland has used a different electoral system for its local elections than England and Wales. It uses a proportional system. It makes it much harder to get overall control of a council, but it does give us a very accurate snapshot of what public opinion is in each place. And let's start here in the Scottish borders. Now, this is something of a Conservative stronghold. Both of the parliamentary seats are Conservative, one belonging to the former Scottish Secretary, indeed, David Mundell. The Conservatives did well here back in 2017, the last time these seats were contested, and they did well across Scotland. Remember, came second overall under Ruth Davidson. But look at this. So they only had 3 seats out of 34, so long way to go. But already in terms of the first preference vote share, we're looking at the Conservatives down 16%. That is a really, really big loss. They won 5 seats from Labour when these seats were last contested. And funnily enough, it's the Green Party picking up there, despite the fact that this area is one of the strongest voting, no voting regions of Scotland in the 2014 referendum. And of course, the Green Party is a pro-independence party in Scotland. But still, long way to go. But the thing is, it's part of something of a pattern in the relatively few seats and relatively few boroughs that we've got, or council areas we've got. For example, Stirling, here we are again. It's been hung since 2003. We've currently got 12 seats to get to the winning post, 6 seats counted. 1 seat the Conservatives have lost, 1 Labour gain. But the really important thing is we're looking for the change in the vote share. And again, there we have 7% down for the Conservatives. Winners this time aren't the Greens, a bit to the SNP, a bit to the Labour Party, a bit to the Liberal Democrats. Let's have a look at the others that we've got in at the moment. Aberdeenshire, another strong Conservative area. It's one of those places where the Conservatives really started to make a comeback at a parliamentary level, both in Holyrood and in Westminster in recent years. Again, we've only had 3 seats counted, so we're a long way to go. There's 70 altogether. No changes in terms of seats yet. Here's first preference share, but again, what we're looking for is the share change. And again, Conservatives down 8%, SNP up 7%, Labour up 5%. So from those, we can see that so far, the results that were coming in, and we can see from the individual wards we're getting in as well, the Conservatives appear to be struggling. And of course, the reason for that is this, the vote share. From Scotland in 2017, the Conservatives, unlike in England, are defending a high watermark. They did extremely well back in 2017 under Ruth Davidson. I suspect they could be in for quite a bit of pain in Scotland today, perhaps in Wales as well, where they had a similarly good result. And so, so far we've had the story of England and the Tories licking their wounds, certainly in London. I suspect you may have Scotland, perhaps Wales, to add to that list as well before the end of the day, Jo.
Well, Lewis, that's very interesting. As you say, it's just the start, but not looking very good for the Conservatives in the seats that you have just shown us so far on those first preferences, because it is a system of proportional representation. I'm going to say goodbye to Jo Twyman. Thank you very much for joining me from Deltapoll. Now it is time for a look at the weather with Matt.
Hello, it's been a wet morning.
This is BBC News. I'm Jo Coburn. The headlines at 11. In local elections in England, the Conservatives suffer some big losses in London, but across the country, Labour only make modest gains.
We've had some difficult results, and you can see that in London. I would say, though, that we are mid-term, and it's quite a mixed picture, because you look elsewhere, whether that's in Hartlepool or Nuneaton or Thurrock, we've actually made gains.
Believe you me, this is a big turning point for us. From the depths of 2019, that general election, back on track.
It's the Liberal Democrats who've gained the most seats, including winning Hull from Labour. And the Greens have also been doing well. Within the next hour, we're expecting to hear from the Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey. Counting is underway for the local elections in Scotland and Wales, and also in Northern Ireland, where voters have been having their say over forming a new government. Good morning and welcome to BBC News with continuing coverage of the election results across the UK. So far, it's been a mixed picture for all the parties. In England, the Conservatives have lost control of 3 flagship London councils, Westminster, Barnet and Wandsworth, to Labour. Keir Starmer has called the results a big turning point, despite only modest gains outside the capital. The Conservative Party chairman, Oliver Dowden, acknowledged the party had suffered some difficult results, but insisted it was no time to change the leader. The Liberal Democrats and Greens have also made gains across England. Counting has begun in council elections across Scotland and Wales and in Northern Ireland, where voters have been electing members of the Stormont Assembly. So here's the state of play for the parties. You can see here 77 out of 146 councils declared in England, of course counting underway elsewhere in the UK. Labour now over 1,200 councillors, they've added 34. Conservatives have lost 121 councillors, their total is now 545. The Liberal Democrats have added 58, making their total 261. And the Greens have added 23 councillors. Their total is now 39. So that is the state of play so far. Our political correspondent, Helen Catt, has the story.
A symbolic win for Labour. Wandsworth in South London, Tory for 44 years, until now. Even in an election about local services, having the lowest council tax in the country didn't keep it blue.
The cost of living crisis did come up, as did the massive cuts from the government since 2010, and also Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was a vote winner for Labour, as indeed was Keir Starmer as well. And I'll remind you, Hugh, in 1998, a year after our landslide victory, we didn't win this seat in Wandsworth. In 2002, a year after our landslide victory in 2001, we didn't win this seat in Wandsworth, and we've done it in 2022.
Wandsworth's former leader blamed the loss on the cost of living and said what he called the issue of Boris Johnson was raised. That was echoed by some Tory councillors elsewhere.
It's Partygate, it's not just Partygate. There's the integrity issue. Basically, I just don't feel people any longer have the confidence that the Prime Minister can be relied upon to tell the truth.
In a surprising upset, the Conservatives lost Westminster Council to Labour, as well as Southampton and Barnet in North London, where the Labour leader went to mark the result.
This is a massive turning point for the Labour Party. From the depths of 2019, we're back on track now for the general election, showing what the change that we've done, the hard change we've done in the last 2 years, what a difference it has made.
Others maintain things aren't as bad as they could be for the Tories.
We've had some difficult results, and you can see that in London. I would say, though, that we are mid-term, and it's quite a mixed picture because you look elsewhere, whether that's in Hartlepool or Nuneaton or Thurrock, we've actually made gains. And I think if you take the whole picture of this, it really doesn't demonstrate that Labour has the momentum to form the next government.
Labour won the newly created Cumberland Council in the northwest, but it's not expecting big gains, and it's had losses too. The Liberal Democrats, who've had a strong night, took whole council from it.
And what was really interesting about last night's results, in places like Wimbledon and Cheadle and elsewhere, we were winning seats where we need to win seats in the next general election. So it was a great night for those councillors.
The Greens too have made gains. Also overnight in Bristol, voters chose to scrap their mayor in a referendum. This is all only a partial picture. Almost half of England's councils have yet to start counting and will do so later today. So too will all of the councils in Wales and Scotland. And counting will start for all 90 seats in the Northern Ireland Assembly, with polls suggesting that Sinn Féin could become the largest party for the first time. Helen Catt, BBC News.
So let's talk to our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young. She's just joined me here in the studio. We're hoping to catch up with Ed Davey, the Liberal Democrat leader, shortly, who is in Wimbledon. We can see him here. Here he is, arriving to supporters there. Obviously, the Liberal Democrats will say that they've had a pretty good night so far. Here he is in Wimbledon. I think we can hear him. Let's just listen to what he's got to say.
An earthquake in North Shropshire has now turned into a shockwave across our country that can see this Conservative government come tumbling down. It's a movement of millions of people who are saying they've had enough. Enough of energy bills going up, of tax bills going up, and their standards of living going down. They're saying they've had enough of this Prime Minister. And I think the tectonic plates of British politics are shifting. And now it's up to Conservative MPs to shove the Prime Minister into the abyss. There's a message to Conservative MPs here in Wimbledon and across our country, that if they don't get rid of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, if they don't start giving people the support they need, struggling families and pensioners across our country, if they don't start listening to the British people, the Liberal Democrats are coming for you. You see, the Liberal Democrats are winning across the country again. Yes, we won here in Wimbledon. But didn't we do well across other parts of London and then in Tory heartlands, West Oxfordshire, Cameron's backyard, Hull off the Labour Party? We are winning across the country again, and that is great news for so many people. But I want to thank you, Liberal Democrat councillors and campaigners, because you've been at the heart of this success. We're winning again because of you working so hard all year round, campaigning for your communities. And that's what's different about the Liberal Democrats. We really care about our communities. We represent them. Our community politics is what people are coming towards, because they know if you elect a Liberal Democrat, you get a great local champion. Yeah. People who will listen to you, will hear your concerns. People who will fight for a fair deal for you, your family, and your community. And people who will stand up for your community and for that fair deal. The British people deserve far better than this discredited Prime Minister and this out-of-touch Conservative government. Yeah. Millions of pensioners and families deserve more support, not high unfair tax rises. They deserve nature and rivers and lakes that are being filled with sewage, filthy sewage, to companies that the government won't stand up to. They deserve an NHS where people aren't having to wait for hours for an ambulance or wait for a day GP appointment. They deserve a Prime Minister who won't take them for granted, a Prime Minister who doesn't lie and who doesn't break the law. And what Liberal Democrats are saying, if you want a better politics, if you want a stronger economy, if you want a more caring society, if you want a fair deal, then choose the Liberal Democrats. Come and join us. Choose the Liberal Democrats and turn away from this shocking Conservative government. Thank you very much.
Fighting talk there from the Lib Dem leader, Ed Davey. Apologies about the pictures. Hopefully viewers could hear everything Ed Davey was saying, even though we did lose the picture at times. Vicky Young, the BBC's deputy political editor. Yes, it is fighting talk. I mean, talked about the tectonic plates are shifting in politics. Liberal Democrats, always the party of local government, they used to sort of build themselves as. They've spent a long time trying to come back after being in coalition with the Conservatives in government, and then, of course, their position during the Brexit referendum. Why do you think he is making such a big pitch now and in that part of London?
What's interesting about this is that Wimbledon was a very marginal seat at the last general election. It's Conservative held, has been for a very long time. The Lib Dems got close, but not quite close enough. The council was actually Merton. That's run by Labour, and that won't change. So what the Lib Dems are doing, and you can hear him doing that in everything he says, he's naming parliamentary constituencies because they know that that's their way back, is picking off those areas. And there's a bit of a pattern, southwest London, some of those affluent, leafy areas, not just there, but there's Carshalton, there's Esher, which is Dominic Raab's constituency, where the Lib Dems think that they are the main contender, not Labour, that they think they're the ones who can take those seats against the Tories. So this is a really interesting part of the dynamic going on here, with the Liberal Democrats starting to do better. Later on, we'll hear from Somerset. They expect to do well there. All those areas that they used to be strong in, they fell back, as you say, after the coalition. They hope that they are clawing their way back in there. And that could spell pretty bad news for lots of Conservative sitting MPs. The Liberal Democrats call it the blue wall. They say they're making gains there. Think of the by-elections, Chesham and Amersham, some of those Remainy kind of areas from the Brexit vote. And people there, they say, have turned against Boris Johnson, the kind of Conservative who doesn't quite like what he's doing, and they are willing maybe to look at the Liberal Democrats. And also potentially another by-election, of course, coming up in Devon after Neil Parish's resignation.
Do you think this is where the biggest threat is at the moment for the Conservatives? Obviously, Boris Johnson championed the idea of winning seats that they'd never held, the Conservatives, from Labour in the north of England, in the East Midlands, what we call the sort of former Red Wall areas. Has he neglected to some extent the seats that Conservatives have held traditionally for decades?
I mean, I think that's what those rather concerned Tory MPs sitting in those seats would say. They're worried that, of course, there's been all this focus on the so-called Red Wall, so seats,
levelling up,
seats in the north of England and the Midlands and elsewhere. And they're worried that voters in those southern areas are thinking, well, hang on a minute, why are you paying all the attention to there? You're talking about money going into those places. And then in the southwest, parts of the southwest, of course, not particularly affluent, formerly Lib Dem stronghold, now pretty much completely Conservative. That's the concern there, and that's where the Liberal Democrats think that they can come back and make it very difficult for Boris Johnson. Now, the question for him is, yes, there could well be lots of those kind of seats that they might lose, but is it going to be enough to deprive him of his majority? And if he can hold on, Boris Johnson, and some of those other seats he gained from Labour, then that doesn't spell the end for him in terms of the next general election.
Right. Well, let's talk to one perhaps potentially concerned Conservative MP, and that's Bim Afolami, the MP for Hitchin and Harpenden. How concerned are you by the Liberal Democrats in an area like yours?
Well, I think that we haven't had our results yet, but I can think of last year's results, which were still pretty strong in Hertfordshire and other areas. But, there are other areas where it was less strong. What I can say is that these results, and look, I did a lot of door knocking, not just in my own constituency, but elsewhere. There were people who said, I'm going to register a protest vote. And a lot of those votes went Liberal or Green. And I think that the reasons for that are obvious. Some people were very annoyed about what they consider to be the chaos in Westminster, Partygate, Beergate, whatever it is, there was a lot of people saying, I'm just sick of the lot of you, and they therefore wanted to pick a smaller party. And there are other people who are concerned about the bread and butter issues, whether they be local or whether they be, energy prices, inflation, that sort of thing. And so, look, it's midterm. Things do get difficult. When I look at, and as a keen historian, I was sort of looking at previous sets of local election results where you're seeing much bigger losses and gaining of seats in all parts of the country than we're seeing now. So that's not to say that I'm not concerned, as all Conservative MPs will be concerned about losing any councillors who are very good local councillors for what, may well be national concerns. But we have a very good chance to show the public that we're focusing on the issues that matter to them.
Right. Well, as you say, you've talked to people and they have lodged a protest. What needs to change, Bim Afolami? The leader?
I think there are two principal things that need to change, in my view. The first is that we do need to show and demonstrate, not just rhetorically, but in our actions, that we are dealing with people's difficulty on a cost of goods, cost of living, energy prices, and NHS as well. We need to show people that we're dealing with those things. That's the first thing. And I think that some of the sort of difficulties, political difficulties over the recent weeks and months haven't made that easy for us, but we need to do it. That's non-negotiable. The second thing I think we need to do is I do think that we need to show everybody that we're governing for the whole country with our programme, because one of the difficulties is we had Brexit, we got through that Brexit sort of morass, then we had COVID, and it hasn't been easy for us to show the public our plans and what we're doing for the whole country. And I think that over the coming weeks and months, that's what we've got to show people.
Right. I mean, one Conservative council leader, John Mallinson, has said, I don't think it was helpful to get comments from people like Cabinet Minister George Eustice talking about people using value brands to ease their shopping bills. That just comes over as very patronising. It's not just Partygate. There is the integrity issue. Basically, I just don't feel people any longer have the confidence that the Prime Minister can be relied upon to tell the truth. Is he right?
Well, he's not right. And in relation, first of all, to the comments that George Eustice made, I actually think he's been very hard done by that. What he was asked, he tried to answer a question very directly in terms of talk about different ways in which people can reduce their bills, and he's being pilloried for it, and I think that's very unfair.
But does it show it's out of touch, do you think, Bim Afolami, with the way that you have just set out the concerns of cost of living? Because on the doorstep, how did you answer questions about why are my taxes going up, why are my energy bills continuing to go up? And all right, there's been some help offered from the Chancellor, but overall inflation is soaring. The Bank of England thinks we're going to tip into recession. What does the Tory party, the government, need to do?
Well, the first thing is it's a really complex thing because, as you will know very well, I'm going to try and answer your question directly. Yeah. As you'll know very well, this is to a large degree a global issue. Every single major Western economy is facing very similar things in relation to energy prices and food prices.
Yeah, so you've chosen to put taxes up.
Right. So what we did was for a specific issue or area, which was the NHS, where we needed to recover after COVID and social care. We raised a specific amount of money to deal with those problems. And by the way, people are talking about the NHS and GP appointments and waiting lists as well, right? So that's the first thing. But what we also did is we said, right, we know that people on lowest incomes are having a tough time. So we're going to raise the amount before which you have to pay any tax or national insurance to £12,500. We're going to give special support to the neediest through local authorities, council tax rebate and other things. Now, I'm not saying that is now it. Whatever happens now, We're not going to do anything else. What I am saying, though, is that we've not been blind to it. It's that at the time we had to make that decision, that was, several weeks ago. The situation is different now and the situation may change. And what we have to do, and I'm doing, and I'll be speaking with all my colleagues of all levels of seniority over the coming days and weeks, is to make sure that we take the right action for the next phase of where we think the cost of living issues are going to go.
Well, what is that next phase? I mean, does it really need to happen right now? Because senior Tories are saying there needs to be a reset. Taxes need to be cut. People need to be helped now.
So there are different ways of helping people. One way, of course, You could literally, the government can spend money, and by doing that.
But what would you like to see? What would you like to see?
Let me just answer the question. So if you do that, you've got to do it in a very careful way. Why? Because what we don't want to do is to do what's happened in the United States, which is actually their inflationary problem is worse than ours because of the amount of money the government has spent, because that contributes to inflation. So we've got to be careful about the whole package of what we do. What I want to see is us, as we have a better sense of energy bills in the autumn, which, by the way, we don't have yet, it's May, the autumn will tell us a bit more. So we have to wait a bit to see what's going to happen.
Well, we know that the energy cap is going to go up even further. It's going to be even worse.
But we don't know to what level. And we don't know what's going to happen.
People have just got to struggle on. I mean, the idea of a windfall tax on the oil and gas companies and the massive profits that they have made, its time has now come. Labour and the Liberal Democrats have proposed it. We even heard from the head of BP, Bernard Looney, saying, don't worry, I'll still invest all the money into green energy and transition, even with a windfall tax. Is it time to do that?
So there are two reasons why this isn't a good idea. Let's take Bernard Looney's comment specifically. What he is saying is that the money that he's already committed, which I think is about 18 billion for investment, he is not going to pull if there is some sort of new tax put on it. That is because that money's already there. He already has that money.
Okay,
he's not talking about He's not
changed
talking
your
about
mind,
the plans
though.
we're going to need. No, he's not talking about the things that we're going to need to happen next year and the year after and the year after that, because we are still committed to making our energy greener and and dealing with the issues of climate change. That's the first reason it's a bad idea, a windfall tax. Because I think that would mean that we wouldn't get investment in the years to come. The second reason why it's a bad idea is people talk about these evil shareholders of BP or whatever who are going to get all this money, and why are they getting all this money? You know who the shareholders of BP and these big energy companies are? In large part, they're your pension funds.
Right.
That is money that British pension people receiving their pension today or receive it in the future will also get. So it's very important that people don't think, oh, you put a tax on windfall. Well, it doesn't sound... windfall tax, it doesn't affect them. And we have to bear those things in mind.
Right. I mean, looking at it overall, Bim, the Conservatives have lost over 100 council seats and control of 6 councils. Would you agree that on the basis of that, and for some of the reasons that we've just discussed, Boris Johnson just isn't the electoral asset he was?
I just don't think local elections are about the Prime Minister in most part. They're about a mixture of different things, and you'll see some. You've just
talked about the cost of living, which is very much partly the Prime Minister and the government, or wholly, I should say.
Well, it's about what the government's doing, which of course the Prime Minister is the leader of the government.
Yes,
and will
but
decide
is he
those
still
decisions, but it's not about his person,
isn't it?
And it's not.
Oh, it's not.
Well,
it's irrelevant who's in charge.
Well, no, it's not. It's not irrelevant. But what I'm trying to say is that if you compare back, for example, to the 2000s. Where the Liberal Democrats, by the way, had several thousand more councillors than they have today, or the 1980s, where we had very big swings in local election results, and you still saw Margaret Thatcher in the 80s or Tony Blair in the 2000s get re-elected with very comfortable majorities. We are not in that territory either.
Right, but do you think you're heading that way? Do you think your seat's under threat?
Well, look, I think that what we need to do, all Conservative MPs need to do, is work together and deal with the problems that come. That's what we need to do. That's what people expect us to do. And we shouldn't allow this set of local elections to somehow divert us from that core task, which is making people of this country, their lives better.
Do you think Boris Johnson, the government, has to some extent neglected seats in areas like yours that have allowed the Liberal Democrats and to some extent Labour in other parts of the country to make gains?
Well, no, I don't think it's that. I mean, for example, I look at what we're doing on the green agenda that I know resonates very, very strongly in the south of England. I know, and I'm a child of the south. I grew up in the south. My constituency's in the south. And I know that resonates very strongly. I looked at the reaction to the loss of Chesham and Amersham, which is about 20 miles away from my own seat. I looked at that loss and the reaction to that was the government listening on people's concerns around house building and people's concerns about planning and people's concerns that we need to make sure that is done in a correct way. So actually, I don't buy that analysis.
All right. Bim Afolami, thank you very much for talking to us today.
It's a pleasure, as always.
As results come in, I'm sure we'll see you soon and talk again. Let's get more detailed analysis of the results. We can talk to Lewis Goodall. There he is at the touchscreen. We had first results coming in from Scotland last time we spoke to Lewis. Let's see what he has for us now.
Yeah, a little bit more on Scotland in a moment, Jo. But since you've been talking about the Lib Dems, and we were just hearing from Davey, weren't we? Just as well to focus on them for a moment, because they're having a pretty decent night and morning so far. Gained about 60 seats all told. He happened to be in Wimbledon, which is part of the London borough of Merton in southwest London. Now, you'll see this is actually a Labour borough. It's a Labour hold, nearly all of the seats counted. But the Lib Dems have been doing very well, particularly by off the Conservatives. You can see there they've gained 12 seats, particularly in areas like Wimbledon, and the Conservatives have lost 9. Now, that's important because in Wimbledon is a key target seat for the Liberal Democrats. I think at the last election they were about 600 votes off. It's a very heavily Remain voting area, 63%. Are there other examples where the Lib Dems are giving the Tories a fright? Well, yes, indeed there are. So let's look at somewhere like West Oxfordshire. They didn't have enough seats available to take this borough, but it's David Cameron's backyard, places like Witney. True blue West Oxfordshire, it's been a Conservative controlled borough since 2000, Conservative majority since 2000, but the Lib Dems over the last few years, 54% Remain, part of that realignment that we've been seeing, just edging, chipping away at the Conservative majority, and it's now gone into no overall control. There are other places as well. Colchester, it's another hung borough, hung council, but it's a seat that used to be Liberal Democrat. Again, Conservatives down 4, Lib Dems up 2, Labour also up a few as well. And we're just seeing this in place after place, council after council, in the south of England in particular, and we are expecting that to continue later today as well. We're expecting results from Somerset, a new unitary authority in Somerset. Loads and loads of seats up for grabs. Tunbridge Wells in Kent used to be dominated by the Conservative Party, but the Lib Dems over the last few cycles have just again been chipping away. And that really is going to put the fear of God into certain Conservative MPs, because the Lib Dems just haven't been a factor really for many years, certainly at a parliamentary level for many of these Conservative MPs. If it looks like there is going to be that new threat from the Lib Dems just rising again, it's certainly something that they will be very concerned about in those old southern strongholds. But it's not just the Conservative Party that the Lib Dems have been given some trouble in. There have been a couple of quite unusual results. One was in Hull, which came in overnight. This is somewhere that the Lib Dems used to be strong in sort of pre-coalition years at the end of the New Labour period, but they lost in 2011. But they took back control from Labour of Hull, despite the fact it's a very, very Leave voting place, Hull. 68%, one of the top Leave voting places in the entire UK. So it just shows the Lib Dems are pleased. They think they're finally being able to move on both from the coalition years and potentially, to some extent at least, from the Brexit years, at least where it disadvantages them, but still managing to get advantage from places in Wimbledon and all of those other Remain areas that I've just been talking about. But let's have a look about what the sort of task ought to be for the Lib Dems in the round. So this is the Lib Dem local election performance all the way back to the coalition years. In 2010, their high watermark before they entered government, and after that it really was just a disaster after disaster for them, just being punished by the electorate at every electoral event. 2011, 12, 13, 14, just skirting along the bottom. 2015, their nadir of 11%. Some recovery in the Brexit years as they started to hoover up some of that pro-Remain sentiment, and they've hovered around now at about 18% since last year in 2021. They will be hoping that they can do better than that, show they are really back in the game, particularly, as I say, in the south of England. Now, just before I go, Jo, I did promise you that we'd have a look at what's going on in Scotland. Some really interesting results coming in Scotland. You can see over there a few more have come in. Let's have a look at Angus, up in the northeast of Scotland, near Arbroath. This has been a hung parliament, wrong election, got that to look forward to, hung council since 2017. Conservatives did quite well here, like so many places. They used to have the parliamentary seat in Angus, and here you go. So we can't see the seats, but we can see the first preference share. They had the seat until 2019, and look at that, just mirroring that trend that we saw in all of those other places, in the Scottish borders, in Ayrshire, in Stirling, and so on. The Conservatives down 17%, and it being hoovered up by a variety, SNP, Green, Labour. The more results we're getting in from Scotland, it is a very clear trend. The Conservatives are having a very uncomfortable night, and day compared to their very creditable 2017 performance. I think there are going to be a lot of uncomfortable faces in the Scottish Conservative Party, and indeed, presumably, they're going to be blaming one man, and that's not the man, their leader in Scotland, Douglas Ross, but the man in 10 Downing Street, Boris Johnson.
Lewis Goodall, thank you very much for covering that in-depth analysis of the Liberal Democrats and bringing us up to date with those early results in Scotland. We'll, of course, have more from Scotland and Wales throughout the day, and Northern Ireland too. But Vicky Young is here, the BBC's deputy political editor. Let's just go back to the Liberal Democrats briefly, because we had that speech, victory speech from Ed Davey following some, promising results for the party. But the interesting thing is whether this can translate this recovery to some extent in councils in England into parliamentary seats.
Yeah, and that is always their focus, is picking off those seats and going back to other seats that they've had before and lost. That will be what they want to do, the Liberal Democrats, and how they do that is to build up their council representation, and that then, they hope, leads to parliamentary seats. And so for Boris Johnson, that, of course, is a problem. So in these affluent areas, mainly in the south of England, that's where the Liberal Democrats seem to be doing well against the Conservatives. They call it the blue wall. They're chipping against that. What you obviously don't know is how well can they do in terms of numbers. But for Boris Johnson, he's then got to make this calculation, hasn't he? If he can hold on to other places in England, can he sacrifice others in the south? So it's all about how many, because in the end, I think what we've got to remember here is that he won a huge election victory, and it's Labour who are having to make up a lot of that ground, and they've got a huge amount of ground to make up. They would need to win over 100 seats, gain those seats. So they're talking about 20 or so far, which they say that they would be able to gain in parliamentary terms. Clearly, that's nowhere near enough, which is why, although they're having a decent night, Labour, people are pointing to the fact that it needs to be brilliant for them to win the next general election.
Talking to the Conservative MP Bim Afolami in Hitchin and Harpenden, he said he's registered the protest on the doorstep, a lot of it around the cost of living. That's also going to be a very big problem for Boris Johnson, particularly from within his own party, and opposition from some Conservative MPs that actually the whole idea of big state increasing taxes is not something that they feel is going to protect their seats at the next election.
Yeah, and lots of them are very unhappy about that. They're unhappy about the national insurance rise. They think that the government should be doing the complete opposite. And I think that's what's interesting here when you look at the backdrop to these elections. For opposition parties, it couldn't be better. There's been a scandal around the Prime Minister. He's been found of breaking the law of the own COVID rules that he made. There's a crisis with the economy. There's a cost of living crisis. And I think actually that's going to be the problem. And lots of Conservatives do know this, that this may not be the worst part of all of this in terms of the economy. Those suggestions yesterday from the Bank of England predicting inflation of 10%. 10%. And what does the government...
since the 1980s.
Yeah. And what is the government going to do about that? They need a plan. And I think what's worrying lots of Conservatives is that there isn't one. They are very pleased that although this is not going well, this set of local elections, it could have been a lot worse. And what happens in the next 2 years is crucial to all of this. It's not about Brexit being delivered. There are lots of people delighted that happened. It's not about what the Prime Minister's done about Ukraine. It's not about COVID. It's about what comes next. And has he got a plan to deal with all of that? And there are lots of Conservatives who aren't quite sure yet that he does.
I mean, there is this suggestion, we've heard it now from quite a lot of Conservatives, that they will have to come back with some more help. One of the issues for them is in Scotland, where it looks as if Labour is going to overtake the Conservatives to become the second party. And the leader there of the Scottish Tories, Douglas Ross, called for Boris Johnson to go some time ago. And then when the war started in Ukraine, he reversed that position. But it's still very precarious, isn't it, in terms of unionism for Boris Johnson?
Yeah, it is. He's got an awful lot of problems there. And now, of course, last time round, Ruth Davidson, who was a charismatic leader, she was incredibly popular, managed to get the Conservatives, to that second position. But, I think we've got to remember here, we're talking about coming second. No one is talking about anyone knocking the SNP off that first
things have
position.
changed. Everyone always used to say, of course, we're going to win.
No, they're scrabbling around for second place. So in terms of parliamentary seats, actually, that's not going to make an awful lot of difference. The Conservatives could end up losing some there. So you could be in a position by the end of today or tomorrow where the Conservatives are going backwards in Scotland, Wales and parts of England. So, of course, that is a precarious position for Boris Johnson. Whether it's enough in the end to prompt Conservative MPs to try and oust him, I'm not sure it is going to be. There's an awful lot of talk about would more letters go in, they probably will. But is it so disastrous at this moment that they decide they need to act? I'm not sure. And so I think the short term, he's okay. And that's what I mean about what he does next is really important, what he and his Chancellor do next in terms of cost of living, because he will be judged on that, actually.
Well, you mentioned the Chancellor, and we're going to reset in just a moment and remind our viewers of the seats that have changed hands and councils that have been won and lost. But before we do, as you mentioned, Rishi Sunak, he was very much seen as the natural successor to Boris Johnson if there were to be a leadership contest and vote of no confidence that the Prime Minister lost. That has also changed the dynamic, hasn't it, Vicky? Because unless there is somebody automatically for Tory MPs to coalesce around, that makes the challenge more difficult too.
Yeah, and I think that is what's been helping Boris Johnson all along. I mean, what Conservative MPs are going to calculate, because they are pretty ruthless, is Boris Johnson still a winner? That is why they elected him in the first place. Some because of Brexit, but even some who were against Brexit thought, well, I think we can win us an election and win us my seat. That's what they were looking at. So that's what they've got to calculate now. Is he still a winner? And can he do it for them again? Or is he a liability? Now, you know, I think that's obviously what they're going to calculate. Lots of them said to me, look, I really don't want him to be our leader, but I'm really worried about getting X, you know, somebody else. There is no one who's in that position, clear cut, who could take over yet. And so at the moment, that's helping him. And Rishi Sunak, now look, you can't write him off forever.
No.
The fact that we, you know, a year ago, everyone was saying, well, he's a slam dunk to be the next leader, and now he's not, I think shows you how volatile things are.
Well, yes,
so I don't think it's completely over yet for him, but this big test of what's happening with the economy is really going to be difficult for him.
Well, and on parties, of course, law breaking. As you say, the Prime Minister has been given one fixed penalty notice, breaking his own COVID rules, unprecedented, really, historically, in terms of that position. We've yet to hear the full outcome of that investigation from the Metropolitan Police, which could, of course, change everything again.
Yeah, and not just that, but Sue Gray's report, the senior civil servant who's going into the detail. I mean, the interesting thing about the Metropolitan Police, of course, the top line, is that he's been fined, he broke his own rules. But the details of what went on at some of those events could actually just be more politically embarrassing. And then, of course, there's that investigation by the Parliamentary Committee about whether he misled Parliament. So there's still an awful lot of things to come, which could be very uncomfortable for Boris Johnson. So it's certainly, he's not out of the woods yet, but I think he'll probably think, look, it's a pretty bad night for the Conservatives.
Yes,
but we'll say it could have been worse.
Right. Well, look, let's go back to our continuing coverage of the election results across the UK, because so far, as you've been hearing, it is mixed for the parties. In England, the Conservatives have lost control of 3 flagship London councils, Westminster, Barnet and Wandsworth, to Labour. The Liberal Democrats and Greens have also made gains across England, and counting now has begun in earnest in council elections across Scotland and Wales. We're getting the first results in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, where voters have been electing members of the Stormont Assembly. So let's have a brief look at the state of play for the parties. Here you can see English councils, 77 of the 146 councils declared. Labour is on 38, so they have added 3. This is a net gain for Labour. These are net gains and losses. The Conservatives are on 19. They have overall lost 6 councils, and the Liberal Democrats have gained 1. Hung councils, you can see there another 2, bringing the total tally to 16. Let's have a brief look at the key ward analysis, which can tell us quite a lot about the overall state of the party in England. The changes since 2018. 504 of the 738 declared so far. And you can see there that Labour has gone down slightly, minus 0.4%. So they have made gains, significant ones in London. But if you're looking overall at those key wards, they've gone down a bit, not as much as the Conservatives, who have dropped 4%. The Liberal Democrats are up 1% and the Greens are up 3%. So that is the state of play in England at the moment. But let's find out a little bit more about what's happening in Scotland, because Andrew Keir is at the count in Aberdeen with a picture of the situation across the northeast of Scotland. Andrew.
Hello, Joe. Yes, this count centre covers the whole corner of North East Scotland. We've got Aberdeenshire and Aberdeen City. They started counting here at 9 o'clock and we use electronic counting. We have had a number of results coming in, but now they're starting to come thick and fast. We've just had Barney Crockett, who's the outgoing Lord Provost of Aberdeen, re-elected as a Labour councillor here. Now, Aberdeen City has been very interesting because last time round in 2017, the SNP were the largest party here, but Labour and the Conservatives formed a coalition, very controversially, and that kept the SNP out of local government here. The Labour councillors who did that were actually suspended by the party after doing that. Now, there were some rumours that turnout is said to be a bit lower here than it had been previously, around 47% at the last election. There are concerns that could affect the Tory vote amongst the Conservatives here. They have been worried about the so-called Partygate affair, of course. One Tory who was here was saying to me that they had been speaking on the phone to someone, a supporter who'd been raising concerns about the Partygate affair, but then he'd said to them, well, what about Nicola Sturgeon? And of course that Conservative supporter said yes indeed, and of course that means that of course Tory supporters here wouldn't be switching their votes anywhere else because, Joe, of the Constitution, independence is such an important issue. And just speaking about that, the former First Minister of Scotland, Alex Salmond, is at this count as well, in particular for the Aberdeenshire region. He runs the Alba Party now, of course, and one of his best hopes for a candidate, Brian Topping in Fraserburgh, has not made it through. So perhaps not much hope for Alba in this area at the moment, at least.
Andrew, we've just been talking in the studio about how times they have changed when it comes to talking about politics in Scotland. I was interviewing Anna Sarwar, the Labour leader, talking about being honest and candid and saying, you know, we are aiming for second place rather than, of course they want to win, but that actually the main objective will be to overtake the Conservatives. And it looks as if the polls are right, that will happen.
Yes, I think it probably does in terms of the big national picture. Of course, the SNP, all-powerful in local government, and at Holyrood as well, where they have formed a partnership agreement with the Scottish Green Party. So that race for second place, that contest, is really crucial in this. And that's what the Conservatives here are worried about, that they might be pushed out of that second place into third place in local government. But ultimately, at Holyrood perhaps, where it matters more in the Scottish Parliament, they still remain in that second place spot. But they will be worried about what the future now holds for them, I think, if Labour do push them into second place. And under Anna Sarwar, as you mentioned, that leader now has been in post for about 15 months, perhaps a renewed sense of revitalisation and more energy in the Scottish Labour Party going forward, with Douglas Ross, the Scottish Conservative leader, of course, really buffeted by the Partygate affair. He had called for Boris Johnson to go, but then at this conference here in Aberdeen, when Boris Johnson was here in March, just at the beginning of the Ukraine crisis, he changed his mind and said Boris Johnson should indeed stay. So that is proving a problem for the Conservatives at the moment, it does seem.
Right, on the constitutional issue, second independence referendum, Andrew, of course the SNP will say they've got a mandate. They've continued to have a mandate and they probably will continue to do so after this set of results too. The guarantee of holding that second independence referendum by the latest at the end of 2023, but still no sign of any movement from the government at Westminster.
Do you know, it's really interesting you say that, because of course this has formed part of the campaign. It's formed part of the SNP's campaign. They say they do indeed have a mandate for that second independence referendum in that timescale that you have set out. No change from the government at Westminster, and the pro-union parties here are saying it's not what people want. One poll suggesting it wasn't what people wanted here either. But I think now we've got through these elections in the coming weeks with an SNP party conference planned probably for June. I think Nicola Sturgeon will want to do something about independence, want a bit of forward momentum on that, throw some red meat, as the political cliche goes, to her supporters to prove that she's trying to act on that. I mentioned that Alba party of Alex Salmond, they were set up to try and drive momentum on independence. So now with these elections out the way, it perhaps is likely we will see some movement from Nicola Sturgeon, her next step, as it were. But of course, the UK government just continue to say no to that.
Andrew Keir, thank you very much. Perhaps we'll join you a little later when there are more results coming in Scotland. Our deputy political editor, Vicky Young, is here. Just picking up on that. I mean, this deadline, really, that Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, has set herself for the end of 2023, it's still very difficult, isn't it, to know how that is going to play out when Boris Johnson's government still insists that they're not going to give this so-called permission to allow a second independence referendum because they don't think it is what people want. And at the moment, the polls are still quite split, sort of 49-51 or 50-50. It's very difficult, but it is a very important part of the whole makeup for Boris Johnson and the Conservative and Unionist Party.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think they would have hoped, the Conservatives, that they, having clawed their way back a little bit in Scotland, that they would stay there, but that doesn't seem to be happening. I think what's really interesting about how this has played out is the division between the Scottish Conservatives and the party,
they've tried to
the rest of the country. And as you said earlier, Douglas Ross being the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, one of the first and most outspoken critics of Boris Johnson over Partygate, originally calling for him to resign and only rescinding that when the war in Ukraine started. And actually that's a pattern that you can see in other parts of the country. So the Scottish Conservatives branding themselves very differently, wanted to be seen to be very separate. They feel that Boris Johnson is dragging them down and dragging their hopes down. And you've seen that in these local elections in some parts of the country where the leaflets going out from the Conservatives, well, it was hard to tell they were Conservatives. They were coloured green, they were called local Conservatives. Even on the ballot paper in lots of places, they were called local Conservatives. And it's different in different parts of the country, but this is the kind of problem that they've got, I think, the Conservatives. And it's all very well the Tories in Scotland trying to show themselves to be separate. Just not sure how successful that's going to be. In terms of the referendum, I mean, I think the interesting thing for Nicola Sturgeon is, obviously, she only wants to call one when she thinks she's going to win it. I mean, it's basic politics, isn't it? And as you say, the poll suggesting that's not the case. Of course, the party incredibly popular at all levels of government, as that is showing in Scotland. Now, whether that translates into an overwhelming desire for a referendum right now, which they would win easily, well, that isn't the case. So you are just stuck in this position where the Westminster government is going to continue to say no and basically say to Nicola Sturgeon, what are you going to do about it?
Well, let's pick up on your theme of a sort of patchwork of results across England, certainly so far for all the parties. Let's catch up with Lewis Goodall. He is at the touchscreen there in the newsroom. Lewis.
Yes, Joe, we've focused a bit on some of the successes that Labour have had in London, obviously, Southampton, Cumberland as well, and perhaps there's glimmers of some success to come in Scotland. We could talk about that in a bit maybe, but it's just as well also to look at where Labour perhaps haven't done quite as well as they might have hoped. Let's look at somewhere like Bolton, for example. Bolton, full of classic bellwether parliamentary seats for sure. I think the Labour Party would hope that, all the other things being equal, ahead in the polls, they might do reasonably well in a seat in a borough like Bolton. Well, as you can see, not so great after all. Conservatives up one, Labour static, Independent lost one. I think we can see the percentage of the vote there. Labour actually have a slightly greater percentage of the vote. That's just how the seats fall sometimes. So you can see actually the change. Labour actually down 1% in Bolton by comparison to 2018. Independents up considerably, Conservatives up considerably. And of course it all comes back to some extent about the thing that we've been talking about a lot. We've been talking about on and off for many years now, that realignment within British politics in Leave-oriented places like Bolton away from the Labour Party to the Conservative Party. Remember, it was 58% Leave. Bolton, the only Conservative-controlled borough in Greater Manchester. Well, it's hung, but I think the Conservatives are one way or the other going to stay in control. Let's look elsewhere as well. Dudley. Not so long ago, had a Labour seat right up until 2019. Dudley North, Ian Austin's seat, well, at a borough level, it went Conservative in 2021. It's very much staying that way. Yes, Labour managed to gain 2, Conservatives down 2, but really not exactly great progress by comparison to what you might be hoping for if Labour were on the precipice of power. Hartlepool's an interesting one. You'll remember the by-election, of course, last year, Joe, in 2021. Part of the sort of delayed red wall effect, I suppose, in Hartlepool being lost, those slew of Labour seats that the Labour Party lost, Leave voting seats that the Labour Party lost in 2019. Conservatives up 2, You can see there 15 there. Nonetheless, it is true to say that if you go ward by ward in Hartlepool, the Labour Party is up considerably in most of its wards, and the Conservative Party is down. And it goes back, and it's just as well to emphasise, I suppose, Joe, it just goes back to what we've been talking about all along. It all depends on when you're comparing to and from. Are you comparing from 2018, 2019 or 2021? The Labour Party, by comparison to 2021 and 2019, both drubbings, the local elections last year, the general election of 2019, it's doing better. By comparison to 2018, it's basically doing about the same. Outside of London, it's doing a little bit worse. That's not great for the Labour Party, considering Jeremy Corbyn was not the most popular Labour leader who has ever been. It was something of a high watermark for Jeremy Corbyn, but that wasn't saying a great deal. And indeed, if we have a look slightly further down the line, slightly further into history, the biggest leads, this shows the biggest leads in opposition for each opposition leader in a set of local elections. And as you'll see, it doesn't necessarily mean the fact that you do well in local elections that you go on to win the next general election. Tony Blair most certainly did in 1995. He got 46% of the vote in 1995. Obviously, he went on to an enormous landslide victory in 1997. But then again, William Hague beat Tony Blair quite handily in the local elections of 2000, 38% to 29%. He gained 1 seat net in the 2001 general election. Really appalling result for him. Became the first leader of the opposition, Conservative leader of the opposition since Austin Chamberlain, not to become Prime Minister. Michael Howard again beats Tony Blair 2004, doesn't become Prime Minister. 2008, David Cameron beats Gordon Brown very handily indeed. Obviously, he does go on to become Prime Minister, but he doesn't win a majority, of course, in 2010. 2012, Ed Miliband beats David Cameron in 2012, doesn't go on to become Prime Minister. 2016, Jeremy Corbyn just about beats David Cameron, it would have been then, 31%, 30 in the 2016 pre-Brexit, last pre-Brexit set of local elections. He didn't go on to become Prime Minister, although he did well-ish at the 2017 general election. So local elections, Joe, are not a surefire thing for predictive success for a leader of the opposition, but certainly Keir Starmer will be hoping at the end of the day, when all the votes are counted, that at the very least he comes out on top at this set of local elections. The margin, though, may be rather thin.
Goodall there at the touchscreen. That was a fascinating trot through past local election results and what happened to former leaders of the two main parties and whether it translated into wins at a general election, which to some extent is what local elections are about. They are, of course, also about who runs your local services. Joining us now is the Labour MP for St Helens North, Conor McGinn. Hello to you, Conor.
Hello, Jo.
You're the Deputy National Campaign Coordinator for the Labour Party. What do you think these results tell you about the state of your party as a growing electoral force, having just looked at those past leaders and whether they do translate any gains at a general election?
Look, I'm interested in the here and now in the context of today. I'm not a sophologist, I'm a realist. This was a turnaround election for the Labour Party. The comparison that I'm interested in is with where we were in 2019, when frankly a catastrophic election defeat led to what can only be described as a near-death experience for the Labour Party. The very existence and future of the party was in question. I think 2 years into Keir Starmer's leadership, we are making progress in the places that we would want to, where we need to win parliamentary seats. We won a council in Southampton last night. We won in Cumberland, where we have Copeland, we have Carlisle and we have Workington. If Workington Man won the Conservatives the last election, then they're in serious trouble, because last night Workington Man and Workington Woman actually voted Labour. So across the country we are making the progress that we expected and that we wanted to make. We had tremendous results in London, but we still clearly have work to do. I think I would be the first to acknowledge that, and Keir Starmer acknowledged that this morning too. We got to continue the forward momentum. We got to keep the work going, and we got to keep the change that's in the Labour Party underway so that we reconnect with the electorate.
All right, well, let's concentrate on the here and now. If you don't want to look at whether or not these results show that you could be a potential force at the next general election, you've gained 37 seats. Now, that's actually a lot less than the Liberal Democrats so far, who've gained 60 seats, nearly double what you've achieved. And in fact, Labour has only won a few more seats than the Greens. They've gained 24 councillors. So it's far from a spectacular or even particularly strong Labour performance.
Jo, the share of the popular vote last night in places like Great Grimsby, where we were 22 points behind last year, show us winning that seat. In Hartlepool, which we lost in a by-election, show us winning that seat. Ipswich, show us winning that seat. The Wolverhampton seats, the West Bromwich seats that we lost, these key core Labour seats that went away from us under the last leadership and in 2019. Last night shows they are coming back to it.
Right.
It's far from a done deal.
Yes.
People are frustrated with the government. They don't like being lied to. They don't like the hypocrisy. They're also facing a huge cost of living crisis, which our campaign focused on. We ran a good, tight, disciplined campaign talking to people about the issues that matter. And across the country, from coast to coast last night, from Southampton to Ipswich to Cumberland, we've shown that we can win again. And we need to keep that work going. Look, there is no adulation here. There is no huge celebration.
Okay.
But I don't want to denigrate, by the way, the results in London. And I don't think that people should do that. That was not a given by any stretch of the imagination. The hard work of our activists, of our candidates, to win councils that the Conservatives have held since 1964 in Westminster, the flagship Wandsworth, that is a huge and a great achievement. And I don't accept this false binary that says because you do well and you win in London, you can't win elsewhere in the country. We're recovering everywhere in the country.
Well,
I hope Wales and Scotland show that today.
Are you recovering everywhere? I take the successes in London. They're hugely important for the Labour Party, symbolically and substantially in that sense. But there are parts of the country that you need to win back from the Conservatives if you are to have a chance at forming the next government. You cited some places, of course you would, where Labour has done well. But John Curtis, our elections expert, has said overall the gains are modest. You could look at Amber Valley and Nuneaton, where the Conservatives have held quite strongly. I mean, you've won 4 councils in total, 3 of them in London and all in the southeast of England. You've lost 1 council in total, and that's Hull in Yorkshire. Would you accept that you are struggling to cut through outside London and the south, apart from a few notable examples?
No, not in the slightest, and I bow and show great deference to Professor Curtis's knowledge of numbers, but his comparison is a statistical one between 2018 and the electoral cycle then and today. Mine is a political one between where the Labour Party was in 2019 and where it is now.
We're comparing these really to 2018. I know you want to look at 2019 because of that general election performance.
Well, I think it's not unreasonable, Jo, given that we lost 60 seats and the Tories were returned with an 80-seat majority, to identify it as a significant event that might have had some impact on the electorate where we need to recover the seats in the places that we have lost. But as I say, I'm the first to acknowledge, which is why I'm back at work today along with the rest of our elections team and with Keir Starmer, focused on continuing the forward momentum and continuing to win. There are big challenges. There is a legacy that we inherited that we've needed to change. The last 2 years have shown that we've done that. Look at Barnet. You know, I feel particularly, personally, strongly and very emotional about our result in Barnet. The stain of anti-Semitism on the Labour Party, Jo, was one that we have fought very hard over the last 2 years to address, and the result in Barnet shows that Keir Starmer's pledge to do that is one that he has kept.
All right, just very briefly, because we're going to get results from Northern Ireland and the election there to the Stormont Assembly this afternoon. They aren't local elections, as I say. What are you expecting to happen there?
I mean, I'm a participant in British elections. I'm not a commentator on Northern Ireland elections. But look, I think it's one that we'll watch closely. I think the priority for us in the Labour Party is that the Stormont executive is restored and that good governance takes place in Northern Ireland so that people there get the health, the education and all of the other services that they need to be improved and that are required. The Conservative government needs to work with the Irish government and get that institution restored.
Conor McGinn, Labour MP, thank you very much for talking to us. If you want to find out the result in your area, head to the BBC News website or BBC News app and enter your postcode. You'll also find lots of election analysis and the latest reports from our teams around the country. Let's get the latest weather with Matt Taylor.
Hello, last minute.
This is BBC News, the headlines. In local elections in England, the Conservatives suffer some big losses in London, but across the country, Labour only make modest gains.
We've had some difficult results, and you can see that in London. I would say, though, that we are mid-term, and it's quite a mixed picture because you look elsewhere, whether that's in Hartlepool or Nuneaton or Thurrock, we've actually made gains.
And believe you me, this is a big turning point for us. From the depths of 2019, that general election, back on track.
The Prime Minister called it a tough night for the Tories. We're expecting to hear from Boris Johnson in the next few minutes. Success for the Greens and the Liberal Democrats, who've gained the most seats so far, including taking Hull from Labour.
The British people deserve far better than this discredited Prime Minister and this out-of-touch Conservative government.
Counting is underway for the local elections in Scotland and Wales, where all council seats are up for grabs.
We are 4 hours into the count in Northern Ireland, still very early days. I'm Anita McVeigh at the Titanic Exhibition Centre in Belfast, one of 3 count centres for these Northern Ireland Assembly elections. Join me for the latest updates and analysis.
Well, as I said, we are expecting to hear from Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister. He has been in Ruislip and talking to activists there and saying and putting it down to midterm challenges. Let's have a listen.
Prime Minister,
yes.
Going into this election, you said that you would take personal responsibility for the results. The results aren't good. You've lost 120 councillors at least so far. You might end up losing 200 to 300. Flagships, Wandsworth, Westminster, Conservative councillors who are very angry at you and think you're the reason. Do you take responsibility?
So, of course. And first of all, I want to pay tribute to Conservative councillors up and down the land. Conservative councillors who've won, those who have sadly lost, and they do a fantastic job and they deliver better value for lower council tax up and down the country. Yes, you're right. It's mid-term and it's certainly a mixed set of results. And we've had a tough night in some parts of the country, but on the other hand, in other parts of the country, you're still seeing Conservatives going forward and making quite remarkable gains in places that haven't voted Conservative for a long time, or if ever. And so, leaving aside the commentary, the big lesson that I take from this is that this is a message from voters that what they want us to do, above all, 1, 2 and 3, is focus on the big issues that matter to them, taking the country forward, making sure that we fix the post-COVID economic aftershocks, get us all through COVID, through the economic aftershocks in the way we got through COVID, fix the energy supply issues. That's where the inflationary spike is coming, and keep going with our agenda of high-wage, high-skill jobs. That's what we're focused on.
But these are big losses. Westminster, Wandsworth, no Conservative leader in decades has lost those seats. And your neighbouring MP here, David Simmons, he said this morning that a lot of people were very angry about you and your law breaking in Downing Street. And he says you have to face up to that.
Of course. And as I say, David, this has been a tough night for Conservatives in some parts of the country, and in other parts of the country we're actually moving forward. And so for midterm, it's quite interesting that it's a mixed set of results. And I think the lesson that I take is that, you rightly quote the views from the doorstep, but the lesson is we've got to get on with the stuff that matters to people. We've got to keep delivering on our agenda, putting 20,000 more police out on the streets, getting 50,000 more nurses into our hospitals, continuing with the biggest programme of infrastructure investment this country has seen for more than 100 years, and uniting and levelling up.
But despite all of those things, the issue on the doorstep was about cost of living. And just yesterday, the Bank of England said we are facing 10% inflation, a recession. That is all coming down the track. What's not coming down the track is your high wage, job economy. What's coming down the track is much more pain for people. And what are you going to, not what you've done already, but what are you going to do to address that?
So I think that is completely right, and that's the lesson that I think we all need to take. What's going on right now is that the global economy, you've seen inflation spiking in the US, in Europe, and in Australia and New Zealand, and it's driven by the cost of energy. And that is the thing that we've got to focus on. For decades, we failed to invest sufficiently in UK domestic energy security. We let our nuclear energy completely collapse. We haven't done enough to put in renewables in the way that we can, put in more wind at the scale and the pace that we can. So that is where we want to go. Now, I'm not going to pretend to you, Damien, that the answers, there isn't going to be a difficult period as we come through the aftershocks of COVID. There is. But what I'm going to tell you is that this government is absolutely determined to keep going with every ounce of compassion and ingenuity that we have, get people through the economic aftershocks, help people with the costs, but make sure that we address these supply side issues, particularly energy, in order for the economy to keep growing.
You say you're going to help people with the costs. You say you're going to help people with the costs.
A high wage,
but that's not coming down the track. What's coming down the track is recession and 10% inflation. It's going to erode everybody's spending power. But what you could do right now, you say you're going to help everyone with energy costs. One thing you could do right now is a windfall tax. We saw Shell with massive profits yesterday. Yeah. Why don't you do that right now?
So I had the head of Shell in yesterday, and the head of BP, and I've talked to them both, and our message to them, and what is very, very clear. It's guys, this is a moment when we need you as a country to invest massively in clean, green renewables, in the stuff that is going to make a difference to people's energy prices.
But that's not going to reduce people's bills this year.
What we don't want to do is make the same mistakes as previous governments, fail, as I've just been saying, fail to invest in our energy supply. So that's the message that we're giving to the big energy companies. And it's frankly better for them to take that cash, put it in to wind farms, put it into hydrogen, put it into stuff that will make a big difference to our ability to cope with the global energy price spike. And above all, make sure that this country is protected in the future so that we have more long-term energy security. That's what we're going for. I say one thing about this government is it does big, difficult things. And we need to fix our energy supply. We can do it. It will take some tough decisions. But in order to do that, you need investment in energy supply. You need investment for the long term in UK nuclear, in wind,
that's fair enough,
in hydrogen,
it's the price,
and all the rest of it.
People's bills right now that people are worried about, not the future. But I want to ask you...
But on that, don't forget, Damien, what we're already doing. And I appreciate that. And I know how tough it is to cope with the energy price.
But there are things you can do right now, and you're choosing not to do them.
We're putting £22 billion of taxpayers' money in to support people, to help people with the energy price spike. You know about the council tax abatement, £9.1 billion just to help with energy.
That's not going to take. That's going to give a tiny fraction of what their bills are.
And there are other things. There are other things that we're doing. But the point I'm trying to make to you is that this government got Brexit done, had the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe.
Can I ask you something different? Because I know time is short.
It's serious, because I think our viewers would like to know why I'm taking this approach. I think what the country needs is a government that will take a big decision about how to fix our energy supply. And you don't do that simply by clobbering the companies that we need to make investment in our domestic energy security. Now, that's why we're taking this approach.
Now, one place that this election could have a very significant result is Northern Ireland, and we could well see, projections have been going into the vote, that Sinn Féin emerge as the majority. In Northern Ireland, if that happens, if the majority of parties majority of people have voted for parties that support the arrangements that you set up with the EU, the protocol, the trading arrangements, if the majority of people back parties that support that, will you work with those parties to make that arrangement work, that protocol, those trading arrangements work?
So the most important thing is that we continue to support the balance of the Good Friday Agreement across all communities in Northern Ireland. That's what we're going to do, and whatever arrangements we have, they've got to have cross-community support. That's what the Good Friday Agreement is all about. That's what the government is going to do. But as for the rest of it, we will have to wait and see what the results are in Northern Ireland.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that was Boris Johnson, as promised, the Prime Minister there, being interviewed by my colleague Damien Grammaticus in Ruislip in the borough of Hillingdon. The Prime Minister's seat is in that area in Uxbridge. trying to concentrate most of the interview, the Prime Minister, Vicky, on energy and energy bills because they have soared, and being asked about why the government hasn't done more to help people with those bills. The price cap has gone up once. It's expected to go up again in the autumn. We didn't hear anything concrete, though, from Boris Johnson about whether he or Rishi Sunak will come back and promise more help for people.
Yeah, and they are under huge pressure to do so, not just from customers who are, really feeling the pinch, but also from their own MPs. And I think what's interesting is he wants to talk or go back over the things he feels he's done right, which is delivering Brexit, which is the vaccine rollout, which is his leadership over Ukraine, which is all very well. But what is going to dictate the future and the next general election is going to be what he does now in terms of this cost of living crisis, because it's possible that it's going to get a lot worse. So will he cut taxes, as so many of his own MPs want to do? They say, look, we've got better tax receipts than we thought. Why not do something bold like that? Other people saying there should be a windfall tax on those companies. He's not doing that. I think the risk for the Conservative government over this, the Chancellor and for Boris Johnson, is that they look complacent. Now, they would say that they're not, but if they don't come up with concrete action soon, they're talking about the autumn, about maybe a budget then, but lots of people saying, actually, this needs to be done now. And by not acting now, it makes it look like they don't understand what people are going through.
Just briefly, Boris Johnson was asked about the situation in Northern Ireland and the result that we could be expecting. It could be a historic result if Sinn Féin, Nationalist Party, actually becomes the largest party for the first time. One area when it comes to Brexit that critics would argue has not gone well in any sense is what's called the Northern Ireland Protocol, the part of the Brexit treaty agreement that puts Northern Ireland or leaves Northern Ireland in the single market for goods in the EU single market. And the Unionist Party, the Democratic Unionist Party, well, they pulled the power sharing agreement at Stormont, which was pretty seismic. And they don't give any indication of wanting to go back into power sharing unless something quite radical is done to that agreement and protocol.
Yeah, I mean, this is, well, it's going to be potentially an enormously significant moment. But I mean, let's just explain, because Sinn Féin are a party that ultimately wants a united Ireland.
Yes.
So for them to be the biggest party for the first time would be incredibly important, a huge moment for Northern Ireland. And then explaining the power sharing, one can't be there without the other. It's a very unusual situation that was introduced there. So Sinn Féin would potentially be First Minister, but there has to be a deputy. They have the same power, and Jeffrey Donaldson from the DUP has said that he won't join that. So that could throw up all sorts of issues for power sharing. I mean, the first and foremost, of course, they want to have a functioning assembly so they can spend money on important things. They too, of course, have a cost of living crisis. But yes, the Northern Ireland Protocol, this whole point of there being checks on goods going from Great Britain into Northern Ireland is causing a huge problem. Businesses want certainty. The DUP and Unionist parties think something very radical needs to be done. Now, I was told by someone very close to all of this, there would be something in the Queen's speech, a specific bill about all of this that would potentially give ministers the power to override the Northern Ireland Protocol. Incredibly controversial, something that the Unionists in Northern Ireland would like. We've since been told that isn't going to happen. So there's clearly a lot going on around this about what exactly the government in Westminster feel they can do about all of this. But unless they do something, it's hard to see how Stormont can get up and running again.
Let's just remind our viewers and ourselves about the state of play with the party so far in terms of councils that have been called in England. You can see Labour there at the top with 38 councils. So far, they've added 3. This is a net gain. Overall, Conservatives on 20 councils with a net loss of 6. And the Liberal Democrats have 4 councils. They have added 1 to their tally. I think we can see the number of councillors too. For Labour, that has meant 1,235 councillors, so they've added 36. The Conservatives have lost 128 councillors. They are down to 556. And the Liberal Democrats have added more, actually, than Labour so far on plus 61. So they have 273 councillors. Residents' groups, strongest showing, 42. They've added 8. And the Greens are on 39. They have added 23. Well, let's test the temperature in one part of England on the back of those results. Luke Walton is in Newcastle for us. Luke, tell us what's been happening there.
Well, Jo, no dramatic changes here in the North East. Starting with Tyne and Wear, Labour has long run the 5 Tyne and Wear councils and looks set to carry on in control of all 5, although we are expecting the Gateshead result in the next few hours. Overall, I'd say Labour's performance solid but not sensational. Perhaps that's not surprising because they were defending most of the seats up for grabs, so they didn't have much room for progress, if you like. One of the more interesting contests was in Sunderland. Labour has lost a swathe of seats in the city over the last few years, and it was nervous. The Conservatives had been talking up their chances, and the Prime Minister actually went to Sunderland on Monday. But in the end, Labour hung on. It actually lost only 1 councillor to the Lib Dems, and the Conservative group leader there said that actually he felt potential Tory supporters had been put off by Partygate. In Hartlepool, the picture was much more promising for the Conservatives. They picked up an extra 2 councillors. They were already the biggest party there, and they will remain in a coalition with independents. Of course, Hartlepool was the place where the Conservatives made that sensational parliamentary by-election victory last year, and it's become sort of almost of totemic significance to the Conservatives. So that was a big psychological boost for the Conservatives. In terms of the other parties, some progress from the Lib Dems, who picked up a couple of seats in Sunderland and 1 in Newcastle. So modest gains for the Lib Dems. Are still quite a long way off getting in shouting distance, I think, of parliamentary seats in this part of the world. But a real boost for the Greens here. They actually doubled their representation on South Tyneside from 3 to 6. They'll become the official opposition there. But I suppose the most significant result across the region is over to the west in Cumbria, in the new Cumberland Authority, where Labour won by a clear majority. Now, this is in part of Cumbria where the Conservatives have a lot of MPs and also previously a lot of councillors, but they lost 14 councillors, at least in notional terms, because this is a new Cumberland council, but compared to the councils that it replaces, the Conservatives are well down. They were extremely disappointed, and the Conservative leader in Carlisle, John Mallison, blamed Partygate and the cost of living. He said people no longer had confidence that the PM can be relied upon to tell the truth.
Luke, in terms of the issues on the doorstep, is it cost of living across the board? How much salience has the Partygate issue had in these elections?
Well, you're right that cost of living is absolutely huge. I've been sort of out on the doorstep talking to voters and talking to canvassers as well, and they do see that as the number one issue. Of course, the North East has the lowest take-home pay in the country, so it's perhaps even more important here. But it's also true that Partygate has really damaged the Conservative, and particularly the government's reputation here. It's well known that Boris Johnson had a kind of almost a personal connection with voters in some parts of the North East. He was felt to be a Prime Minister who could reach parts of this region that other Conservative leaders had not managed to. I think that has been severely affected. When I've been out doing Vox Pops in the last few months, people have actually been coming up to me to tell me what they think about what's been going on in Downing Street. So there's no doubt that has had a real impact.
Luke Walton there in Newcastle, thank you very much for that update. Our political editor in the East Midlands, Tony Rowe, now joins us from Nottingham. Tony, what can you tell us?
Well, actually, I'm in Ripley in Derbyshire and outside the offices of Amber Valley Borough Council. And the council here actually sort of went against trend, if you like, because Labour actually lost 3 seats on the council. Last year, they were running the council. They had a disaster last year. Now the Conservatives have actually increased their majority. And you were talking there about the effect of Partygate. Now, this is where Nigel Mills, the Amber Valley MP, has his seat. He was the first to call on Boris Johnson to quit after the Partygate fine, and local Conservatives here say that probably helped them because it was no longer an issue on the doorstep because they didn't have to defend it because the MP had said it was indefensible. So that, I think, made a difference. Labour, on the other hand, although disappointed, they lost seats, and they say when you add up the votes, the number of votes cast, they say the Conservatives were down by 2,300 and their vote was up by 600. So they're taking some consolation there.
Tony Rowe, thank you very much for joining us and bringing us up to date there, also in Amber Valley, an important sort of bellwether, if you like, in terms of how the parties are doing. Vicky Young, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, is here still with me. You have a result from Wokingham.
Yeah, so a tip here from Wokingham now. That's, very much, true blue Tory area. Bad news again for the Conservatives, where the Lib Dems think that because they have gained several seats, that the Tories have lost that council, pushing it into no overall control. Now, this is another one of those areas. It's not as tightly fought in the parliamentary terms as places like Wimbledon, but the Liberal Democrats certainly would have their eye on that. It's the seat of John Redwood, of course, former cabinet minister, very senior Conservative. It was fought at the last election by Philip Lee. And, they weren't that close, but they were close enough that they feel this is now within their sights. And it's that pattern in Surrey and southwest London, places like Esher, Dominic Raab's seat, Wimbledon and others, where the Liberal Democrats think they can make gains. And the first place they start to do that, they say, is through council. So it will be probably into no overall control, but more bad news for the Conservatives in the south of England.
Well, let's get some more analysis across the board with Lewis Goodall, who's in the newsroom at the touch screen. Lewis.
Yes, Jo, let's stay in the south of England and turn to another prominent Conservative MP's constituency, Welwyn Hatfield. It's the constituency of the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps. Has been a Conservative seat since 2005, when Mr Shapps won it from Labour. And it's a really good illustration of kind of where the Labour Party and the Conservatives are at now, because as you can see here, this is the result that we've had in. I had all of the seats in, all 17. The Conservatives retain the majority. They've essentially had it for ages. There was a brief period of no overall control from 2019. But the Conservatives are now down 2. Labour up 1. The Lib Dems up 1. But the thing is, back in 2021, when they took control of the council again, the Conservatives had a really good night. They took, I think, 4 seats from the Labour Party at a period when you wouldn't necessarily expect them to do so. And that's exactly, as we've been saying, the story overall, that Labour has recovered from a really bad year in 2021, but it hasn't recovered so spectacularly that it's making fantastic gains. It's making some solid gains in places where you might expect it may do so. Well, in Hatfield, it's a Leave voting area in Hertfordshire, but it's not spectacularly Leave voting, as you can see. London, commuter belt, some demographic change. It's a sort of place where Labour, you wouldn't necessarily expect them to win at the next election, but certainly they would hope to be doing a little bit better perhaps than that. Another good illustration, we talked a little bit earlier on about Swindon. At that time it looked like the Conservatives were up, but it's basically exactly the same story as Welwyn. Again, the Conservatives have held the council, but when we spoke before it looked like the Conservatives were up. They're actually a little bit down. They're -1. I think with only 1 seat left to declare now. Labour are up. It's exactly the same story here. Back in 2021, a year ago, the Conservatives did really well. They won quite a few seats off Labour. Bad result for Labour. This time, Labour doing a bit better, not making spectacular gains, but decent gains in a part of the world where, in terms of one parliamentary seat, Swindon South, they really ought to be competitive. So it really, those 2 seats really encapsulate sort of where we're at. Since Vicky was mentioning Woking, I think we can have a look at the result. We haven't got a full result from Wokingham yet, but let's have a look to see where we are. So 7 seats counted, 11 yet to declare. So Lib Dems are up 1 at the moment. Let's just have a look at the vote share so far. 46 to 30, but you can see the Conservatives, not all the seats in, just under half at the moment, but down 13%, Lib Dems up 8. Just adds to that sense of southern discomfort that has been building up in this set of election results, but has been doing so for some years now.
Lewis Goodall, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll come back to you before 1 o'clock. Now, we haven't had that many results from Scotland so far, but we can talk to Ian Blackford, the SNP's Westminster leader. Welcome to you. What would a good result for the SNP look like, Ian?
Well, look, at the end of the day, I think the important story from Scotland is the fact that the Tories are being rejected. Their vote is down. And I think what really is important today is that the voters have sent a message to Boris Johnson. And I think really there's 2 things that count. One is, of course, the cost of living crisis. More needs to be done. And the other issue is Partygate. And I think people in Scotland have made it very clear that they want no more of this from Boris Johnson and his Conservatives. So I think you're going to find today it's a very clear message, and I'm sure this is going to be a day where we can celebrate the fact that the Tories have got the message that we expected.
One of your key pledges, of course, is another referendum on Scottish independence, latest by the end of next year. How are you going to deliver that, Ian?
Well, let's get the elections out the way today, Jo, and then we can move on.
Well, no, come on, because it's a central part. It's a central part of the SNP. It's what you are there to deliver and promise your supporters. I'm just interested in how it can happen practically by the end of next year.
So I'm just going to go on and explain that. What you'll see the government in Edinburgh doing over the course of the coming months is bringing out a number of papers, setting out the vision of how we can create that greener Scotland, how we can develop our energy resources, for example, how we can deliver a fairer Scotland and one where we drive investment into the economy. And of course, that means Scotland becoming an independent country and being in the European Union. So we will lay out that vision. We'll engage with the voters in Scotland. We'll ask those on the unionist side to debate those issues with us as well.
Yes.
But I think the very clear message, Jo, and my message to whether it's Boris Johnson or anyone else in number 10,
yes,
that they have to respect democracy, and they have to respect that in the elections to the Scottish Parliament last year, there was a pro-independence majority. Both ourselves and the Greens stood on a platform of delivering a Scottish referendum. We're now seeing the costs of Brexit, what the damage that's done to our industries, the impact of food inflation that we've had from Brexit. And Westminster has to realise that voters in Scotland have a right to have that discussion, that debate, in that vote on Scottish independence before the end of 2023.
Yes, but the thing is, having a debate, and you say you're certainly doing the work around the economic prospectus of an independent Scotland. An independent Scotland wants to rejoin the EU and make that application. That will take time. Then, of course, there is the issue of the border between an independent Scotland and the rest of the UK, as well as setting out the currency. That's a lot of work that needs to be done between now and the end of 2023. Can you give me a cast iron guarantee that this referendum is going to happen?
Well, we have a mandate for that referendum, and we absolutely fully intend to make sure that it happens.
Right.
It's a promise from us, and we need Westminster to recognise that the people of Scotland have that sovereign right to have that referendum. We will lay out the perspectives, and all these questions that you put there, we will happily answer in detail over the course of the coming months. It's about having that positive vision that we can sell to the people of Scotland, how we can drive investment in the economy.
As you know, Westminster continue.
I'm happy to go through all these questions that you've asked.
Well, why not? Why not now? Actually, I'm not sure we have all that much time. But on this issue of the legal advice, should the Scottish Government now publish any legal advice they receive about another referendum?
Well, you'll know that the Information Commissioner has laid a challenge to the Scottish Government that we have to respond by the 10th of June, I think it is.
Yes, it is.
The First Minister will do that. You'll know, Jo, the difficulties that any government has, that any legal advice that it gets is
So is that a yes or a no then?
Well, what I'm saying is that the First Minister will give her answer to that by the 10th of June. We'll carefully consider what the Information Commissioner has
Well, the Information Commissioner has said publish the legal advice.
And of course, you know that the Scottish Government will look at the determination that the Commissioner has made, has the right of appeal if it chooses to make it. But at the end of the day, the fundamental issue of all of this is the right of people of Scotland to have a referendum and for Westminster to respect the sovereign wishes of the Scottish people. That's the key issue.
But in the meantime, if the government, and it shows no signs of moving away from its position of saying there's been an independence referendum, we're not going to grant permission for another one. So will you take the UK government to court over this?
Well, you know, the simple fact of the matter is, let's wait and see what happens today. But I suspect the SNP are going to be the largest party by some way in this election.
So what's your plan?
We've won every election for the last few years. Is Boris Johnson or anyone else in number 10 really going to deny democracy?
Well, on the basis of what we know so far, yes, in that sense. So what are you going to do?
Oh, you should be asking that question to Boris Johnson.
Oh, I'd love to, Ian. But what are you going to do in the meantime?
It's utterly ridiculous. Let me just say that when you win an election on a prospectus of having a referendum, that when you have someone else in another parliament in Westminster that seeks to frustrate democracy, that's really quite a serious issue. So the question is for Boris Johnson and others, why will they not respect the results in a democratic election? Because that's the issue.
Well, maybe it's because a lot of people in Scotland would say, focus less on the issue of another independence referendum and focus on the issues around the cost of living and the responsibilities that the Scottish Government actually has in terms of health and education. Hang on just one second, Ian, because I'm going to show our viewers, and I will take you through this latest graph on Scottish councils. We're looking at Glasgow, and this is the first preference share change since 2017. And as an indication of whether people are happy with the SNP government, it's gone up 1% for Labour, this first preference share change since the last time it was contested. Obviously an absolutely critical council of Glasgow. It's gone down 7% for the SNP. What does that say to you?
Well, I think you can judge us at the end of the day when we've got the
Well, no, let's just judge you on Glasgow. Let's just judge you on Glasgow, because Glasgow is extremely important in terms of the battle between you and the Labour Party.
Jo, with respect, we're very early in terms of the declarations. We're picking up seats all across the country, and indeed we've picked up one seat in Glasgow as things stand at the moment. But, when you talk about dealing with the cost of living crisis, what we have done is that we've increased benefits that are under our control, the Scottish benefits, by 6%, double what has been done by Westminster. We've introduced the child payment. They're initially £10, then it's increased to 20, and now it's gone up to 25. We're taking meaningful action where we've got responsibility to seek to protect people. And it's the fact that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak are asleep at the wheel, where people are having to make tough choices as to whether or not they can put food on the table or whether they can heat their homes. Westminster needs to recognise that we're in the teeth of a real crisis. Inflation is spiralling. Let's be out of control. And action is required now. Next week, when we have the Queen's Speech debate, the government should be coming forward with measures now that put cash in people's pockets. The idea of giving people a loan in October simply doesn't cut it.
All right.
So Westminster needs to accept its responsibilities. We're doing our bit. And I'll tell you what, if Scotland was independent, then we'd be doing an awful lot more now to protect people from this cost of living crisis.
All right, well, we'll have to talk again, won't we, about that prospectus for independence that you've yet to unveil. Ian Blackford there, thank you very much, the SNP's leader at Westminster. Let's talk to Vicky Young. Listening to that, I mean, it really is a stalemate, isn't it, on the issue of that second independence referendum, but a lot of people will no doubt be shouting at the screen, what about the issues that the Scottish Government does actually have control over? And these elections, these local elections, are also a referendum on how local services are run.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, that's often lost, isn't it, in the debate. When we're looking at it from a UK point of view, we talk about the referendum, about the future of Scotland and its place in the United Kingdom. But of course, for the SNP, who have been in power now for so long, I think it is slightly changing a little bit. I think there is more focus on what they've done and what they haven't done when it comes to education. I think we saw during the COVID pandemic, of course, that focus on health and what decisions were being made in Scotland. So I think they're coming under a little more pressure, the SNP, about what they're delivering in terms of those domestic services, if you like. And then going back to that issue of the referendum, and I can't see any scenario in which Boris Johnson is going to allow that to happen. I just can't see it happening. And I think there is a question for the SNP about when they want it to happen, the timing, because of course, for very obvious reasons, they want to have it at a time when they think they can win it. And it certainly isn't clear cut at the moment that is the case.
Vicky Young, BBC's Deputy Political Editor, thank you very much for keeping me company in the studio as we continue with coverage of the local elections and elections to the Stormont Assembly. Let's get some more analysis and some more figures and statistics in terms of council seats won and lost from Lewis Goodall. There he is at the newsroom touchscreen.
Yes, Jo, some results just coming in thick and fast now. Just had this from Maidstone. Tories have now lost Maidstone in Kent to no overall control. Still by far the biggest party on the council, but they've lost 2 seats. Labour up 1, Green up 1. Again, that sense of sort of southern discomfort that we're seeing in parts of the south of England will continue to be a theme today. Rossendale in Lancashire, key part of the country, this particularly replete with marginal parliamentary seats. The Labour Party lost this council to no overall control in 2021. Labour were 1 short, the Conservatives were 4 short. Well, you can see there the Labour have won 2 seats, the Conservatives have lost 3 seats. So this was a council that the Labour Party had long controlled. Again, that really dire performance last year, stemming that loss, reversing that loss to some extent, and back in control of the council. The Labour Party will be pleased with that, and of course they'll have their eye on Rossendale and Darwin, Jake Berry, the former Conservative minister's seat at the next general election. Then we've got Solihull, that's just come in as well, in the West Midlands. This has been long been a Conservative stronghold, this, but again, there's been a little bit of loss, mainly to the Lib Dems there.
I've lost Lewis. We seem to have lost the sound there from Lewis Goodall, which is a shame. We can always return in a few minutes' time. He was giving us an update of some of the latest councils and seats that have been called. It does look as if the Conservatives are struggling in some of those former Conservative southern heartlands. But as I say, we'll go back to Lewis Goodall shortly when we get the sound. Now, I was talking with Vicky Young, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, about Northern Ireland a little while ago. It's likely to be the big story of the coming days. Anita McVeigh is at the Count Centre in Belfast. Anita, how's it looking there?
We're ready for you, Jo, absolutely. Well, we are just over 4.5 hours into this count, so very early days here. This is one of 3 count centres across Northern Ireland for the Northern Ireland Assembly elections. That's the election for Northern Ireland's government. I'm at the Titanic Exhibition Centre in Belfast, and if we take a look at the picture so far, well, it's difficult to predict because of the voting system here. It's a form of proportional representation, the single transferable vote, so every voter, they can choose their first preference and then give a series of preferences for other candidates, as many or as few as they like. So it can take a while for the overall picture to emerge. Let me just tell you a little bit more about what's happening here. So we've got the counts for the 4 Belfast constituencies, North, South, East and West, as well as South Down and Strangford. It's a real sea of activity behind me here. Just a snapshot of turnout from 2 of those constituencies. We're hearing in North and South Belfast that the turnout was just over 61% and just over 64% respectively, which is very, very similar to 2017, the last Assembly elections, which were the high point in almost 2 decades in terms of turnout, but that's not necessarily the picture right across the board. So what's going to happen in this election is that Northern Ireland's 90 MLAs will be elected. The parties which have the right to nominate to the positions of First and Deputy First Ministers will be decided. Whether that actually happens, well, that is one of the big talking points of this election campaign. More on that in just a moment, but let me bring in our Ireland correspondent Chris Page, who's with me at the start of a very long day. Chris, early doors, what's catching your eye?
Well, Anita, I think it's fair to say at this early stage, the party which is the happiest with how things are going is the Cross Community Alliance Party, the party that defines itself as neither unionist nor nationalist. Alliance members had been very hopeful of a big breakthrough in this election. They've been 5th in the Stormont pecking order for many years, but on the way things are going, judging by the tallies which party activists are making down there on the floor, they are confident of picking up some seats where they've never had Stormont representation before, places like North Belfast, for example, South Down, which are both being counted behind us here. And they also think in the constituencies where they already have 1 seat, well, they might pick up an extra one. For example, that is a possibility, we're told, in South Belfast. So that would be a major change in the political landscape. Alliance moving from 5th place to 3rd place, maybe even a very good day into 2nd place. The question is, how will that affect the votes of the 2 biggest parties, the DUP and Sinn Féin? In effect, what this election could come down to, Anita, is which of those 2 parties will lose the most seats. Now that I'm expecting to make gains, whichever loses the fewest seats will probably come out on top.
And then I alluded to it in my introduction, Chris. After this count is done, the 3 counts are done, what's going to happen next? Will we have yet another Stormont stalemate?
It certainly does feel that way. If the polls are correct in suggesting that Sinn Féin is on course to be the largest party, that will mean the party's Vice President, Michelle O'Neill, is entitled to be nominated to the position of First Minister, the first ever nationalist in the history of Northern Ireland to hold that position. However, under the power sharing rules, the biggest unionist party, likely the DUP, have to agree to go into coalition with her. The DUP has said, firstly, it won't be going back into the devolved government unless the Brexit trade border with the rest of the UK, known as the Northern Ireland Protocol, is scrapped. And they've been firming up that rhetoric this morning. Sammy Wilson, DUP MP, has been referring to the protocol as a poison. So that certainly is one block to the formation of a future Stormont executive. Also, both of the main unionist parties, the DUP and the Ulster Unionists, haven't confirmed whether they would go back in a situation where Sinn Féin was the largest party. So hardly anybody here today thinks that we're going to be in a position where devolved government's formed anytime soon.
Yeah, and just very briefly, Chris, because we're almost out of time, if Alliance do really, really well, lots of people are already talking about the need for a change in the way the Assembly rules work so that there is more weighting given to those centre ground parties.
That's right, and if Alliance do end up in a very good position, I think it is likely to be even more talk about that. Alliance themselves want the power sharing rules to be reformed so that, for example, contentious legislation won't be decided by a cross-community vote and cross-community vetoes wouldn't be available to the Unionist and Nationalist parties. We could look at redesigning the whole power sharing structure.
Chris, thank you very much. So at this early stage, I would say just look out for those centre ground parties and see how they do, particularly the Cross-Community Alliance. For such a long time in Northern Ireland, people have been put in one of two boxes. You're either in the nationalist camp, you're in the unionist camp, you're green or orange. But actually that really seems to be changing, and that could be one of the really big stories out of this election. Back to you, Jo.
Thank you very much, Anita, there in Belfast. Very interesting turnout. Yes, you said it's similar to the last time those seats were contested, still very high in the 60s. Let's find out the picture in Wales, because our correspondent Thomas Morgan is in Cardiff. Thomas.
Yeah, counting has begun here. We haven't had anything declared just yet. I'm here in the count in Cardiff back in 2017. There were rumours that Labour might lose the capital. However, they won it. And I think we're hearing now, at the moment, they're really confident, Labour. They are hoping they'll be able to take about 2/3 of the seats in the council here. I think really what we're hearing across Wales at the moment really is that Labour seem more confident in Wales than they do in England, and the Tories do feel a little bit less confident here than they do over in England as well. I think in Monmouthshire, their only council that they hold as a majority, the Tories, I think they hope they'll be able to hang on to that. I think what will be a really interesting watch are the three councils in the south, Merthyr Tydfil, Bridgend, Blaenau Gwent, the three that Labour lost back in 2017. We're hearing they're very confident of taking them back. And up in North Wales as well, the other heartland that Labour do have across Wales. Denbighshire, Wrexham and Flintshire, historically Labour, but in recent times votes have been moving towards the Tories. I think, again, as I mentioned, Labour confident there, possibly not winning majority in all of those three local authorities, but at least Flintshire, you'd have thought, where they have a minority now, good chance possibly in Wrexham as well, really. So as I say here, I think that possibly looks like what could be the outcome here is that they might do a little bit better in Wales than England, and it might replicate what we saw last year actually in the Senedd elections in Wales, where Labour had a really good result, getting 30 of the 60 seats in the Senedd. Mark Drakeford's Welsh Labour exceeding expectations really. Elsewhere for the other parties, Plaid Cymru, I think very mixed in Cardiff, not that happy here, not that happy in the valleys. They'll be looking, really pushing to win another council, possibly on the Isle of Anglesey, possibly in West Wales. And we're also hearing that two Green councillors, possibly, two Green Party councillors, may have won their first seats in Denbighshire for the very first time. So just showing really that the Tory votes that were won in 2017 might not all be going towards Labour. They may also be split between some of the other parties, such as Plaid and the Greens that I mentioned there as well.
Thomas Morgan there in Cardiff. Thank you very much for giving us that picture from Wales. Of course, we haven't had results coming in yet in their large number from either Scotland or Wales, or in fact Northern Ireland. But I'd just like to show you two results in English councils. We've got Walsall here. It's a Conservative hold. 38 for the Conservatives, 20 for Labour. If we have a look at the seat change, they've added one, the Conservatives, and so have Labour. So there hasn't been a particularly big move. That's in Walsall. But let's have a look at Swindon too. It's another hold for the Conservatives in an English council. The seats, the Conservatives are on 34 and Labour on 23. Straight fight between the two big parties. But here, Labour have improved. The seats change. If we have a look at that, they've gone up 3. The Conservatives, although they've still held it, have dropped by 2, as have the Liberal Democrats. We could have a look at the share, the all-important share of the vote there in Swindon. You can see the Conservatives on 43%. Labour has gone up by 46%. And you can see where the share change is since 2018, when these seats were last contended, and it's gone up 4% for Labour, but 1% for the Conservatives too. Well, let's stick with the Conservative performance in English council elections. They have lost, the Conservatives, almost 1 in 4 of the seats they've been trying to defend in these English local elections. And earlier I spoke to Conservative MP for Hitchin and Harpenden, Bim Afolami, about whether the Tories were offering enough support on the cost of living. Yeah.
As you'll know very well, this is, to a large degree, a global issue. Every single major Western economy is facing very similar things in relation to energy prices and food prices.
Yeah, but you've chosen to put taxes up.
Right. So no, what we did was for a specific issue or area, which was the NHS, where we needed to recover after COVID and social care. We raised a specific amount of money to deal with those problems. And by the way, people are talking about the NHS and GP appointments and waiting lists as well, right? So that's the first thing. But what we also did is we said, right, we know that people on lowest incomes are having a tough time, so we're going to raise the amount before which you have to pay any tax or national insurance to £12,500. We're going to give special support to the neediest through local authorities, council tax rebate and other things. Now, I'm not saying that that is now it. Whatever happens now, we're not going to do anything else. What I am saying, though, is that we've not been blind to it. It's that at the time we had to make that decision, that was, several weeks ago. The situation is different now, and the situation may change. And what we have to do, and I'm doing, and I'll be speaking with all my colleagues of all levels of seniority over the coming days and weeks, is to make sure that we take the right action for the next phase of where we think the cost of living issues are going to go.
Well, what is that next phase? I mean, does it really need to happen right now? Because senior Tories are saying there needs to be a reset. Taxes need to be cut. People need to be helped now.
So there are different ways of helping people. One way, of course, you could literally, the government can spend money by doing that.
But what would you like to see? What would you like to see?
Let me just answer the question. So if you do that, you've got to do it in a very careful way. Why? Because what we don't want to do is to do what's happened in the United States, which is actually their inflationary problem is worse than ours because of the amount of money the government has spent, because that contributes to inflation. So we've got to be careful about the whole package of what we do. What I want to see is us, as we have a better sense of energy bills in the autumn, which, by the way, we don't have yet, it's May, the autumn will tell us a bit more. So we have to wait a bit to see what's going to happen.
Well, we know that the energy cap is going to go up even further. It's going to be even worse.
But we don't know to what level. And we don't know what's going to happen.
People have just got to struggle on. I mean, the idea of a windfall tax on the oil and gas companies and the massive profits that they have made, has that now come? Its time has now come. Labour and the Liberal Democrats have proposed it. We even heard from the head of BP, Bernard Looney, saying, don't worry, I'll still invest all the money into green energy and transition, even with a windfall tax. Is it time to do that?
So there are two reasons why this isn't a good idea. Let's take Bernard Looney's comment specifically. What he is saying is that the money that he's already committed, which I think is about 18 billion for investment, he is not going to pull if there is some sort of new tax put on him. That is because that money's already there. He already has that money. Okay, he's not talking about he's not talking about the plans we're going to need. No, he's not talking about the things that we're going to need to happen next year and the year after and the year after that, because we are still committed to making our energy greener and dealing with the issues of climate change. That's the first reason it's a bad idea, a windfall tax. Because I think that would mean that we wouldn't get investment in the years to come. The second reason why it's a bad idea is people talk about these evil shareholders of BP or whatever who are going to get all this money, and why are they getting all this money? You know who the shareholders of BP and these big energy companies are? In large part, they're your pension funds.
Right.
That is money that British pension people receiving their pension today or receive it in the future will also get. So it's very important that people don't think, oh, you put a tax on windfall. Well, it doesn't sound... windfall tax. It doesn't affect them. But and we have to bear those things in mind.
Right. I mean, looking at it overall, Bim, the Conservatives have lost over 100 council seats and control of 6 councils. Would you agree that on the basis of that, and for some of the reasons that we've just discussed, Boris Johnson just isn't the electoral asset he was?
I just don't think local elections are about the Prime Minister in most part. They're about a mixture of different things, and you'll see
You've just talked about the cost of living, which is very much partly the Prime Minister and the government, or wholly, I should say.
Well, it's about what the government's doing, which, of course, the Prime Minister is the leader of the government.
Yes, but is he still
but it's not about his person,
isn't it?
And it's not.
Oh, it's not. Well, so it's irrelevant who's in charge.
Well, no, it's not. It's not irrelevant. But what I'm trying to say is that if you compare back, for example, to the 2000s, where the Liberal Democrats, by the way, had several thousand more councillors than they have today, or the 1980s, where we had very big swings in local election results, and you still saw Margaret Thatcher in the 80s or Tony Blair in the 2000s get re-elected with very comfortable majorities. We are not in that territory.
That was Bim Afolami talking to me a little earlier, the Conservative MP for Hitchin and Harpenden. Now, Labour has made some significant gains in London, winning Westminster, Wandsworth and Barnet. But outside the capital, the party is currently down by 3 seats. Earlier, I spoke to the Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, in Wakefield. She told me Labour have made gains since 2019, but still have a lot of work to do.
Well, we started in 2019 with one of the worst results for Labour for generations. And we have had a lot of work to do to rebuild, to earn back trust. And I think that's what you've seen Labour doing across the country under Keir Starmer. We've made clear that Labour's changed and we are building support. And we've got to keep doing that. We've got to keep earning back the support for people who left us in 2019 and other people across the country who we want to support. Labour's ideas, Labour's policies, for example, on the cost of living crisis, the issue that's come up time and again on the doorstep, and the things we've put forward to cut people's energy bills. So we're going to keep doing that. But for us, I mean, having been campaigning through the 2019 election and beyond since then, we have really seen a very big turning point since then.
All right, but it's the scale of that turning point, Yvette Cooper, because Labour wants to be the party of the next government. Keir Starmer, we just heard from my colleague Lewis Goodall, said that he would recover those seats, so many of them lost across former Labour heartlands in the north of England. The results so far don't show really very much indication of that. In fact, I'm just going to show our viewers, and I'll take you through it, Yvette, the key wards analysis in England, the change since 2018 when these seats were last contested, 470 out of 738 declared. Labour have gone down by 0.4%. So you've actually gone slightly backwards. The Conservatives have gone further backwards, the Lib Dems have gone up a bit and the Greens a bit more. But Labour has gone back. Tell me exactly how that shows that you're on your way back to potential government.
Because many of those areas that you're talking about, had that vote share that we've got today or yesterday in the votes been replicated in a general election, we would have won back many constituencies, including some in Wolverhampton, some in West Bromwich, some Peterborough, Stevenage, as well as the ones I referred to at the beginning about Hartlepool and Copeland as well. So constituencies that we lost in 2019 that we would now be winning back. We want to go further. We want to build more support. The tricky thing about comparing with the 2018 elections is that we had in the 2018 elections already won more than half the seats that were up. And so that means there's a limit to what you can do compared to the 2018 elections. But for us, in terms of rebuilding and getting a Labour government in place that can tackle the cost of living crisis, that can stand up for working people across the country, we have to rebuild from 2019. And we have seen, I think, a really substantial turnaround since then. And for many of us, if you talked to us straight after the 2019 election, to have heard that we would have been able to make this progress in these 2 years or just over 2 years under Keir's leadership, I think people would have not believed it could have been possible to make this progress so quickly. We have made that progress. We've got to keep making progress and keep earning back support. That's what we will keep doing.
It's modest, though. You would accept that these are modest gains, and the way it stands at the moment, you're not on course to win the next election. What does that tell you about Keir Starmer's leadership? You say he's turned it around, certainly in places in London, although the capital was already trending towards Labour, and symbolically that is important. But John Curtis, our elections guru and expert, has said that actually Labour is still struggling to make much progress in areas that voted Brexit. Do you agree with that?
But we've just been through some of the examples of Hartlepool and Copeland.
But there are as many examples. But there are as many examples where you're not making that progress.
But you're making your comparison with 2018, and the point is that in 2019, look, it was a really difficult result for us in 2019, and that wasn't just about Brexit, although that was really important for people. It was also about leadership as well. On both of those issues, Labour has moved on now. We have a new leader. We've made clear that our approach now is to make Brexit work, and we are changing, I think, as a party. We're building as well in terms of in Barnet, for example, where we had a real problem, and it was really important to rebuild the vote and support among Jewish communities who understandably had felt very angry with Labour, and Keir has turned that around. So I think you've seen huge changes, and as a result, compared to the 2019 election, we have seen a big increase in support for Labour in a lot of those areas where we lost where we lost constituencies badly in 2019.
Yvette Cooper, the Shadow Home Secretary, talking about Labour's performance. And while we're talking about the Labour Party, let's just show you these pictures because Sir Keir Starmer has been visiting Carlisle. Here he is congratulating activists and councillors there in what looks like quite a wet Carlisle. It was just a few minutes ago, celebrating the fact that Labour has won the new unitary authority in Cumberland. And of course, we'll have much more coverage of all the election seats and councillors right across England. We're waiting for many more results in Scotland and Wales. They've just started coming in Scotland. All the authorities have been contested in both Wales and Scotland, where 16 and 17-year-olds are also voting. And in Northern Ireland, we haven't actually had results from there yet, but it could be one of the big consequential results of this set of elections as people vote for people to sit in Stormont. If you want to find out the result in your area, head to the BBC News website or BBC News app and enter your postcode. You'll also find lots of election analysis and the latest there. Let's get the latest weather from Thomas Schaffenacker, and it's goodbye from me.